I never should have agreed to house sit for Professor Ellison. The job seemed simple enough when he offered it. A week in his countryside estate while he attended a conference overseas. He said his property needed a presence to deter intruders, though it seemed unlikely anyone would wander up to such a remote place. The house sat at the end of a narrow, twisting road, surrounded by dense woods. Its Victorian architecture jutted up against the sky like jagged teeth, a place both beautiful and unsettling. But the money was good, and I was between jobs. What could go wrong? The first day passed uneventfully. The house was massive, its hallways winding like veins through a body, leading to countless locked doors. Ellison had given me access to the essentials: the kitchen, living room, and a guest bedroom that overlooked the woods. He left instructions on how to feed his 2 elderly cats, a vague warning to ignore the locked rooms, and a list of emergency numbers, none of which I expected to need. I settled in that evening, enjoying the novelty of such an imposing place. It was that night, just after I'd fallen asleep, that I heard the sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like a branch against glass. I assumed it was the wind and ignored it. But the tapping persisted, growing louder, sharper, until it sounded like knuckles rapping against the window. When I finally sat up and turned on the bedside lamp, I saw nothing. The glass reflected only the dim light of my room and the outline of the woods beyond. I told myself it was a bird or some animal, even though the rhythm of the sound had felt deliberate, almost impatient. The next morning, I found a new note on the kitchen counter, written in Professor Ellison's tidy handwriting. "Please stay out of the cellar," it read. I stared at it for a long time, certain it hadn't been there the night before. Perhaps I'd overlooked it. I tried not to think about how I hadn't heard anyone enter the house. By the second evening, the unease had begun to settle in. The house felt larger than it had the day before, its corners darker, its hallways longer. The cats, who had been skittish but friendly at first, now refused to leave the guest room. They crouched beneath the bed, their yellow eyes fixed on the doorway, their tails flicking in agitation. I left food out for them and explored the house again, hoping to distract myself. The locked doors tempted me more than they should have. The brass doorknobs were cool and smooth under my fingers, the weight of the house pressing in on me as I wondered what secrets lay behind them. But Ellison's warning echoed in my mind. I left them untouched. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It came from the same window, but when I peered through the glass, there was nothing but darkness. I turned away, and the sound shifted. Now it came from the far wall of the room, then the door, then the floor beneath the bed. The pattern was erratic but deliberate, as though someone, or something, was searching for the right point of entry. The next morning, I noticed the changes. Small, subtle things. The photos in the hall, which had once shown Ellison with his colleagues, now depicted people I didn't recognize. A vase on the mantelpiece, once empty, now held a bouquet of withered flowers. The clocks all stopped at precisely 3:17, their ticking silenced as if they had grown tired of marking time. The cellar door was locked, but I could feel something behind it. The air near the door was colder, the wood itself exuding a faint sense of pressure, as though it were holding something back. I considered leaving, abandoning the job altogether, but I dismissed the thought. It would be humiliating to explain to Ellison that I'd fled because of my own imagination. That night, the tapping turned into knocking. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It echoed through the hallways, a sound that felt too large for the space it occupied. I followed it, gripping a flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. The knocking led me to the cellar door. The handle rattled as I approached, as though someone on the other side was trying to open it. My stomach churned as I placed my hand on the knob, bracing myself to pull it open, but the door didn't budge. It was locked tight, the keyhole dark and unyielding. The knocking stopped the moment I touched the handle. I barely slept that night, jolting awake at every creak and groan of the house. The cats didn't move from their hiding spot, their bodies rigid with fear. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. The next day, I discovered footprints. They led from the back door, which I always kept locked, through the kitchen, and into the living room before disappearing altogether. They were faint, smudged impressions of bare feet, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them was only partially there. I decided to call Ellison. His voice was calm, almost amused, as I described what I'd experienced. "The house is old," he said. "It plays tricks on you. Just ignore it. Stay out of the cellar, and you'll be fine." The cellar door was open that night. I found it ajar as I walked through the house, the faint smell of damp earth wafting up from the darkness below. I should have turned away. I should have closed the door and locked it. But curiosity dragged me forward, my flashlight slicing through the shadows as I descended the narrow staircase. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with jars and boxes. At the far end of the room stood a door, its surface marked with scratches, as though someone had tried to claw their way through. The smell of earth grew stronger as I approached, mingling with something metallic and faintly sweet. The door was unlocked. When I opened it, I found a tunnel. Its walls were rough stone, its floor uneven and damp. The air felt heavier the deeper I went, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The tunnel curved sharply, leading to a room that shouldn't have been there. The walls of the room were covered in writing, carved deep into the stone. The symbols were unfamiliar, angular, and sharp, as though they had been etched in a frenzy. At the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface black and shimmering, as though it were made of liquid rather than glass. As I approached the mirror, the symbols on the walls began to glow, faint at first but growing brighter with each step. The air hummed, a low vibration that made my teeth ache. My reflection in the mirror was wrong. It moved before I did, its eyes too dark, its smile too wide. "Why did you come here?" it asked, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I stumbled back, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The glow from the walls pulsed, the mirror rippling like water as my reflection stepped through. It's been days since then, or weeks. The house won't let me leave. The windows show nothing but darkness, the doors leading only to more hallways. The cats are gone, their food untouched. The clocks have started ticking again, but they count hours that don't make sense. Sometimes, I see myself in the mirrors, watching, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, but I don't know if I have a choice. I first noticed the light while walking home from the station. It wasn't unusual for the neighborhood to be quiet this late, but something about that night felt strange, emptier than usual. It was coming from the third-story window of the building across the street, a soft, pale blue glow that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows perpetually streaked with grime and its door bolted shut. Kids used to dare each other to run up and touch it, but I hadn't seen anyone near it in ages. I stopped mid-stride, my breath hanging in the cold air, and stared. The light wasn't harsh, not like a fluorescent bulb or a passing car. It was inviting. It spilled onto the street in thin ribbons, wrapping around the shadows, stretching further than light should. I didn't remember crossing the street, but suddenly I was standing in front of the building. My hand was on the door, which wasn't bolted anymore. The handle turned with a soft click. Inside, the air felt old, thick with dust and silence. The hall was lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the corners, and the floor creaked with every step. The blue glow wasn't coming from the hallway but further in, spilling faintly down the stairs. I told myself I'd just take a quick look. Curiosity, after all, wasn't a crime. The staircase felt endless, the narrow steps winding upward in spirals that seemed wrong for a building so small. My hand grazed the railing, and it felt warm, as though someone had just been holding it. When I reached the third floor, the light was waiting. It streamed from beneath a door at the end of the hall, pooling at my feet. I should have left. I knew that, but I didn't. The door opened before I touched it. The room was empty, but it didn't feel that way. The walls, once white, were cracked and splintered, and the blue light came from a single object on the floor, a small, circular mirror. The surface wasn't glass. It rippled, like water, the light shifting in rhythmic patterns as though it were breathing. I crouched, my pulse quickening, and reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, everything changed. The room dissolved, the walls crumbling into a vast, featureless expanse of light and shadow. The ground beneath me was smooth, reflective, stretching endlessly in all directions. Above me, there was no ceiling, just an expanse of gray sky, swirling faintly as though it were alive. I turned, and the mirror was gone. In its place stood a figure. They were tall and narrow, their silhouette flickering like static. I couldn't see their face, but their presence was overwhelming, filling the space with an oppressive weight. "You shouldn't have touched it," they said, their voice fractured, layered. "I didn't mean to," I stammered. My own voice sounded distant, muffled. "Meaning doesn't matter here," the figure replied. "Only action. And now you've stepped through." "Through what?" They didn't answer. Instead, they stepped closer, and as they did, the ground beneath me began to ripple, spreading outward like waves on a pond. "Why am I here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted the answer. "You called yourself here." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, something about what they said felt true. The figure extended a hand, their movements slow, deliberate. "Do you want to leave?" "Yes," I said immediately. They tilted their head, as though studying me. "It isn't that simple. You've left already." The ripples beneath me grew stronger, and I felt myself sinking, the ground softening beneath my feet. The figure didn't move to stop me. "What's happening?" I shouted, panic rising. "You'll go deeper," they said calmly. "It's the only way out now." The ground gave way entirely, and I fell. It wasn't a fall in the usual sense. There was no rushing wind, no sensation of speed, just a sinking, like I was being drawn through layers of water, each one darker than the last. When I stopped, I was in my bedroom. Everything was where it should have been. My unmade bed, the pile of laundry in the corner, the half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. But the light was wrong. The blue glow was back, faint but unmistakable, leaking in through the edges of my closet door. I stayed where I was, heart pounding. The closet door didn't open, but something pressed against it from the other side, the wood bowing slightly. "You're still between," said a voice. It was my voice. The figure stepped out from the shadows of the room, identical to me in every way but the eyes, which glowed faintly with the same blue light. "What do you want?" I whispered. They smiled faintly, a distorted mirror of my own expression. "You called yourself here," they repeated. "You're the only one who can leave." The closet door began to splinter, cracks spreading across its surface, the blue light spilling through. The other me stepped closer, their hand outstretched. "Take it back," they said. "Take what back?" They didn't answer. The light behind them grew blinding, and the last thing I remember is their hand closing over mine. When I woke, I was back on the sidewalk in front of the building. The light in the third-story window was gone, and the door was bolted shut again. But something followed me. At night, the blue light seeps through the corners of my vision, faint and pulsing. And sometimes, in the reflection of a window or a mirror, I see the other me watching, waiting for something I don't understand. And I wonder if they're waiting for me to step through again, or for them to come back. The first time I noticed the man in the yellow coat, it was a rainy Thursday. I was sitting in my car, parked outside the laundromat, watching droplets race down the windshield while I waited for my clothes to dry. He stood across the street, facing the bookstore, his back to me. The coat was glaringly bright, mustard-colored against the gray of the storm. It hung heavy on him, water streaming off the hem, pooling around his boots. He wasn't moving, just standing there, as still as the trees lining the sidewalk. I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, or for the rain to let up, but something about him felt off. His stillness was too deliberate, like he was waiting for a cue I couldn't see. When I glanced up again, he was gone. I chalked it up to nothing. The rain, the dreariness of the day. It made everything feel stranger than it was. But later, as I folded my clothes inside the laundromat, I thought about the way the coat hung on him, as if it had been made for someone else. The next time I saw him, it was at the park. I'd been walking the path that loops around the pond, trying to clear my head after a long day. The air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot, the smell of autumn heavy and sweet. Families and joggers moved past me in a steady rhythm, the kind of reassuring noise that keeps the world from feeling too quiet. And then, there he was, standing beneath a cluster of bare trees on the far side of the pond. The coat was unmistakable, a slash of yellow against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. He faced the water this time, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. I stopped walking, unsure of why I felt so compelled to look at him. Maybe it was the way the other people in the park didn't seem to notice him, moving past as though he weren't there. Maybe it was the tension in his posture, like a bowstring pulled taut. When he turned toward me, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't his face that frightened me. It was that he didn't have one. The hood of the coat had been pulled low over his head, obscuring everything but darkness where his features should have been. No nose, no eyes, just emptiness. I turned and walked away quickly, my heart pounding, refusing to look back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the hollow space where his face should have been. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even want to say the words out loud, as if acknowledging him might give him more power. But he didn't stop appearing. Over the next week, I saw him everywhere. At the edge of the grocery store parking lot, leaning against a lamppost. Standing just outside the window of my office, motionless despite the bustling street around him. Once, I caught a glimpse of him reflected in the rearview mirror of my car, standing in the middle of the road behind me. Each time, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that it was stress, exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me. But no matter how often I blinked or turned away, the yellow coat remained. It wasn't until the note appeared that I realized this wasn't random. I found it taped to the inside of my apartment door one morning, written on a torn piece of yellow paper. "Do you remember?" The words sent a shiver through me. Remember what? I stared at the note, trying to decipher its meaning, but the letters seemed to shift the longer I looked, as if they were alive, crawling across the page. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash, hoping to bury whatever unease had followed me home. But the question lingered in my mind. That night, I dreamed of water. I was standing at the edge of a dark lake, the surface still and endless. The moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. And then I saw him, wading into the lake, his yellow coat catching the light like a beacon. He didn't stop at the waterline. He kept walking deeper and deeper, until the lake swallowed him completely. When I woke, my throat was raw, and my pillow was damp with tears I didn't remember shedding. The next morning, another note waited for me, this time on my pillow. "You know where to go." I didn't leave my apartment that day, or the day after. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn, watching the clock tick toward midnight as though it might bring some clarity. But the dreams continued, each more vivid than the last. Always the lake, always the man in the yellow coat. Last night, I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed. The coat dripped with water, soaking into the carpet, and the air around him was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I heard his voice in my head, a low, resonant whisper that wasn't a sound so much as a feeling. "You need to remember." And then he was gone. This morning, I knew where I had to go. I'm writing this from the edge of the lake. The water is still, reflecting the sky like a mirror, but the air feels alive with something I can't name. The yellow coat lies folded neatly beside me, its fabric dry and warm, though I didn't bring it here. I don't know what's waiting beneath the surface, but I can feel it calling to me. Maybe this is where the story ends. Or maybe this is where it begins. The old hotel was a local legend, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. It loomed like a specter, its windows dark and its once grand facade weathered to a dull gray. The albatross, as it was called, had been abandoned for decades after a series of unexplained tragedies. People in town whispered about it, swapping ghost stories and claiming to see lights flicker in the windows late at night. I hadn't thought about the albatross in years, not until I got a call from an unknown number, the voice on the other end low and distorted. "Come to the albatross. Midnight. Room 301. I almost hung up, thinking it was some kind of prank, but something about the voice stopped me. It wasn't just the way it sounded, it was the way it felt, like it was spoken directly into my bones. bypassing my ears entirely. I was halfway to the hotel before I even realized I'd started driving. The road leading there was as twisted and treacherous as I remembered, the ocean crashing violently against the rocks below. By the time the albatross came into view, I was gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The building was worse than I remembered. Its roof sagged in places, and ivy crawled up its sides like veins. A single light flickered in one of the upper windows, and my stomach churned as I realized it was coming from room 301. I parked a short distance away, staring at the building as the wind howled around me. I didn't want to go inside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and leave. But the voice still lingered in my head, heavy and insistent. When I stepped inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the scent of salt and decay. The lobby was a ruin, its once polished floors warped and its grand chandelier hanging precariously by a few wires. The only sound was the faint creak of the wind against the walls. I made my way to the stairs, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The carpet was faded and torn, and the wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the building itself was trying to hold me back. By the time I reached the third floor, my heart was pounding. The hallway stretched out before me, dim and endless, with room 301 at the very end. The door was ajar, faint light spilling out into the corridor. I hesitated, my breath hitching. Then, slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but it was pristine, untouched by the decay that consumed the rest of the hotel. The bed was perfectly made, its white sheets crisp and clean. A vase of fresh flowers sat on the nightstand, their fragrance incongruous in the stale air. And on the desk, there was a mirror. It wasn't a mirror I recognized. Its frame was ornate, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. The glass was smooth and dark, reflecting the room behind me, but not myself. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the fear coiling in my stomach. When I was inches away, the mirror shifted. The reflection changed. It no longer showed the room behind me. It showed me, but not me as I was. The version of me in the mirror was older, gaunt, with hollow eyes and pale, papery skin. My reflection stared back at me, unmoving, unblinking, as though it were waiting for something. Then it smiled. The smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp. And then it spoke. "You're late." The voice wasn't mine. It was the same voice from the phone call, low and guttural, vibrating through the air like a live wire. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The reflection didn't move. It just kept smiling, its eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening. "You already know." The air in the room shifted, growing colder, heavier. Shadows gathered in the corners, writhing like living things. I turned to run, but the door had disappeared. The walls were shifting now, the clean, pristine room dissolving into rot and ruin. The flowers wilted before my eyes, their petals blackening and curling inward. The mirror was the only thing untouched, its surface gleaming as the reflection leaned closer. "You're part of it now," it said, the words dripping with finality. Part of what? I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, like a hook sinking into flesh. I doubled over, gasping for air, and when I looked up, the reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the empty room. When I woke, I was lying in my car, parked on the cliffside road. The hotel was gone. At least, that's what I tell myself every time I drive past the spot where it should be. But sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection in a window or a puddle, and for just a moment, it smiles. Too wide, too sharp, and I remember. The house on the hill was supposed to be ours. We'd been looking for months, scouring every listing within a 50-mile radius. Nothing fit, too expensive, too small, too close to the highway. But then there it was, a sprawling Victorian with wraparound porches, intricate woodwork, and acres of untamed forest at its back. The price was shockingly low. A steal, really. That should have been the first clue. We moved in late spring, just as the days were stretching longer and the nights still carried the last chill of winter. There was work to be done. The floors were scuffed, the wallpaper was faded, and the attic smelled like mildew, but it was nothing we couldn't handle. The house had good bones, as the realtor put it. Solid, sturdy, patient. The first sign that something was off came during the unpacking. Emily, my wife, was in the dining room, unboxing her grandmother's china, when she called me over. "Look at this," she said, holding up one of the plates. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed tight. At first, I didn't see it, but then I noticed the smudges on the porcelain, fingerprints, long, greasy streaks that marred the delicate floral pattern. "Did you touch these?" she asked. "No," I said, confused. "They've been in bubble wrap since we packed them." We dismissed it as a weird fluke. Maybe the movers hadn't been as careful as we thought. We washed the plates and moved on. That night, as we lay in bed, the house began to make itself known. The sounds came first. Faint creaks, the low groan of wood settling, and a soft tapping that seemed to drift from room to room. Emily joked that the house was just stretching its legs, but her laugh was tight, forced. The next morning, we found the kitchen window open. "Did you crack this last night?" I asked, rubbing sleep from my eyes. Emily shook her head, her face pale. "I locked it before bed." We checked the lock. It wasn't broken, and the mechanism slid smoothly, as if it had never been forced. It happened again the next night, and the next. The open windows were unsettling, but what truly frightened us was the attic. The door to the attic was at the end of the second-floor hallway, a plain wooden panel set flush with the wall. We hadn't gone up there yet, too busy dealing with the rest of the house. But on the fourth night, we heard it. A noise. Soft at first, like a shuffle of fabric, but then louder, more deliberate. A dragging sound, followed by a sharp, distinct knock. Emily clutched my arm. "What is that?" "I'll check," I said, though my stomach churned at the thought. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, the kind of damp chill that clung to your skin and made your breath hang in the air. The attic was empty, just a low, dusty space filled with cobwebs and broken furniture. But the smell, it was sharp and sour, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. I couldn't place it, but it turned my stomach. I spent an hour searching, opening boxes and peering into every dark corner, but I found nothing. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something strange. The door to the attic wasn't fully closed. I could have sworn I'd shut it behind me. "Anything?" Emily asked when I returned. "Nothing," I lied. The next morning, Emily's hairbrush was missing. We tore apart the bedroom looking for it, but it was nowhere to be found. That afternoon, I found it in the attic, lying in the center of the floor like it had been placed there deliberately. I didn't tell Emily. The house began to change after that. Not in ways we could prove, but in ways we felt. The air grew heavier, the shadows longer. Rooms seemed to shift when we weren't looking, their dimensions subtly wrong. And the noises became voices. They were faint at first, a whisper at the edge of hearing. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent. They called our names. One night, I woke to find Emily standing at the foot of the bed, her face pale and her eyes wide. "I heard it," she whispered. "It was in the room." What was? She didn't answer. The next morning, she found me in the kitchen, staring out the window. "You're not sleeping," she said. I nodded. "Neither are you." We didn't talk about leaving. It didn't feel like an option. The house wouldn't let us go. A week later, I woke in the middle of the night to find the attic door open. The smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. "Emily?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. At the top, I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the attic, her back to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Emily," I whispered. She didn't move. I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under my weight. When I reached her, she turned. It wasn't her. The thing that wore my wife's face smiled, its teeth too sharp, its eyes too wide. "You shouldn't have come up here," it said. its voice layered with something cold and inhuman. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and falling hard. When I looked up, the attic was empty. Emily was in bed when I returned, her breathing slow and steady. But when I touched her shoulder, she was ice cold. We moved out the next day. The house still sits there, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of it. I dream of the attic door, of the thing that wore my wife's face, of the voices calling me back. And every morning, I wake up to find the smell of rotting fruit lingering in the air. The day I noticed the door, it was raining so hard the city looked like it was underwater. I was walking home from the library, hugging a bag of books to my chest to shield them from the downpour. My usual route cut through an alley behind a row of old brick buildings, a shortcut I'd taken 100 times without thinking. But that afternoon, there was something different. The door wasn't supposed to be there. It was set into the side of the alley wall, framed in dark wood and painted a dull, peeling green. The buildings in this part of town didn't have side entrances, just blank walls and the occasional graffiti tag. But this door looked like it had always been there, as if I'd simply never noticed it before. I stopped, rain dripping off my hood, and stared. The door had no handle, no knocker, just a small brass keyhole in the center. A strange feeling settled over me, a mix of curiosity and unease. I wanted to keep walking, to let it go, but the longer I stood there, the harder it was to move. The bag of books felt heavier in my arms. I reached out without thinking, my fingers brushing the damp wood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the keyhole blinked. I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering. It wasn't a trick of the rain or my imagination. The tiny brass circle had contracted, then expanded, like the pupil of an eye adjusting to the light. I should have left. I should have run. Instead, I stepped closer. The rain seemed to quiet as I leaned in, my breath fogging the wood. There was something faint coming from the other side. A soft hum, almost musical, layered with whispers I couldn't quite make out. I don't know how long I stood there, listening. When I finally pulled away, the alley felt darker than it had been, the shadows stretching further than they should. I hurried home, the books forgotten, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the rain. That night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, it wasn't in the alley anymore. It stood alone in an endless white expanse, its green paint peeling in long, delicate strips. I reached for it, the hum growing louder, the whispers turning into words I couldn't understand. Just before my fingers touched the keyhole, I woke up. The rain had stopped, but my apartment felt damp, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. I rolled over, staring at the ceiling, and told myself it was just a dream. The next day, the door was still there. I tried to ignore it, walking a longer route to work, but it was harder than I expected. It lingered in my mind, tugging at my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't reach. By the time I left the office, I'd convinced myself to go back. It was a mistake. The door was waiting, just as I'd left it, the keyhole gleaming faintly in the dim alley light. This time, there was something else. A faint trail of scratches on the ground, leading away from the door and disappearing into the darkness. They looked like claw marks, uneven and deep, cutting into the wet pavement. I knelt to examine them, but as I did, the hum started again. It was louder now, resonating in my chest, vibrating through my bones. The whispers returned, clearer this time, overlapping in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. I don't remember reaching for the door. When I came to, I was standing in front of it, my hand resting on the wood. The keyhole blinked again. This time, it spoke. "Do you want to see?" The voice wasn't a voice at all. It was inside me, echoing in my mind, soft and cold, like water slipping through cracks. I pulled my hand away and stumbled back, my head spinning. The scratches on the ground were gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door, the green paint curling like dead leaves, the keyhole watching me. The hum lingered in the back of my mind, faint but persistent, like a song I couldn't forget. The third time I visited the door, it was open. Not fully, just a crack, enough to see a sliver of darkness on the other side. The air around it was different, colder and thinner, as though the alley had been drained of something vital. I don't know why I stepped closer. I don't know why I looked inside. The space beyond the door wasn't an alley or a room or anything that should have existed. It was vast, endless, filled with shapes that shifted and pulsed, their edges dissolving into the shadows. The hum was deafening now, the whispers rising and falling in waves, pulling me forward like a tide. I felt the doorframe under my fingers, rough and splintered, and leaned in further. The darkness moved. Something large and many-limbed unfurled in the distance, its form rippling like oil on water. It turned toward me, though it had no eyes, and for a moment, the hum stopped. Then it spoke. "You are already inside." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I stumbled back, my head spinning, and the door slammed shut. When I looked around, the alley was empty. The door was gone. For weeks, I avoided the shortcut. I avoided anything that might remind me of the door, but it didn't matter. It's everywhere now. In my dreams, in reflections, in the faint hum that follows me wherever I go. Yesterday, I found a sliver of green paint under my fingernails. And this morning, my apartment door wouldn't open. The first sign something wasn't right came when the elevator doors wouldn't close. I'd stepped into the empty car, pressed the button for the lobby, and waited. But the doors just hung there, wide open, the glowing numbers above frozen at my floor. I jabbed the closed door button, the kind of meaningless action you do out of habit even though you know it rarely works. It didn't. Behind me, the hallway was silent, the faint hum of the building's fluorescent lights the only sound. I leaned out to check for anyone else. Maybe someone was holding the button down at another elevator. But the hall stretched out in either direction, empty. Leaning back inside, I pressed the lobby button again. The panel lit up, but the doors still didn't move. I was already late for work, my coffee getting cold in the travel mug I'd precariously tucked under my arm. I muttered a curse and hit the door open button in frustration, just to reset the system. That's when the doors closed. I felt the faint shift as the elevator began to move, not down, but up. I hadn't pressed any buttons other than the lobby. The numbers above the door flickered once, then vanished. No floor numbers. No ding to mark where I was going. The ascent was unervingly smooth, silent except for the faint hum of the motor. The coffee in my mug rippled slightly with the motion, but I didn't feel the usual lurch or vibrations. I watched the buttons on the panel, waiting for the light above a floor to illuminate, but they remained blank. Then the elevator stopped. The doors opened. A hallway stretched out before me, but it wasn't one I recognized. The walls were stark white, the floors a glossy black tile that reflected the overhead lights. It was sterile, uncomfortably bright, and completely devoid of people. I should have stayed inside. I knew that instinctively, but the strange pull of curiosity, or maybe something deeper, made me step forward. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the doors slid shut behind me with a soft hiss. I turned back. There was no call button on the wall, no sign of an elevator shaft, just an endless white corridor. The air here was heavy, almost damp, like the inside of a cave. I held my breath, listening. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the sound was being caught and thrown back at me from a different angle. Ahead, the hallway branched into two paths. There were no signs, no markers to suggest where either might lead. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like the metallic tang of blood, mingled with something bitter. I turned toward the left corridor, the direction the scent seemed to be coming from, and froze. Something moved. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the harsh overhead lights. But then it shifted again, too fluid, too deliberate to be a product of my imagination. It was a shape, humanoid in form but wrong. Its arms stretched too long, nearly brushing the ground, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though the neck had been broken and hastily reassembled. It stood at the far end of the hallway, its posture slack yet alert, like a predator watching its prey. I backed away slowly, toward the right corridor, my pulse hammering in my ears. The creature didn't move at first. It simply watched, its featureless face tilted toward me. And then, in one horrifyingly smooth motion, it dropped onto all fours and began to crawl. I ran. The air seemed to thicken as I sprinted down the right corridor, the sterile walls blurring past me. My breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of the creature's limbs scraping against the tile floor growing louder with every step. Ahead, the hallway opened into a larger room. I burst through the threshold and stopped dead. The room was circular, lined with mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, distorted and fragmented. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear it, the faint scrape of its movement growing louder. Then I saw it. In one of the mirrors, the creature wasn't crawling. It was standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The mirrors, however, told a different story. In every reflection, the creature loomed closer, its elongated limbs folding and unfolding as it moved. No matter which way I turned, it was always behind me, just out of reach. The air grew colder, my breath fogging the glass as I stumbled backward, desperate to find an escape. My hand brushed against something solid, a door handle. I didn't hesitate. The door opened into another hallway, this one darker, narrower. I slammed it shut behind me, the sound echoing down the corridor. The scrape of the creature's limbs stopped. Silence. I took a cautious step forward, my shoes crunching against something soft. Looking down, I realized the floor was covered in ash. Fine, gray, and warm to the touch. The walls here weren't smooth like before. They were rough, etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when I tried to focus on them. The smell of burnt wood filled my nostrils, mingled with something sour and acrid. Ahead, the hallway ended abruptly, opening into another space. This one was dimly lit, the glow coming from dozens of old-fashioned lanterns hanging in midair, their flames flickering as though stirred by an unseen breeze. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested an object that looked impossibly out of place. A key. It was large, ornate, its surface engraved with the same shifting symbols that adorned the walls. The moment I stepped closer, the room seemed to hold its breath. Behind me, the scraping sound began again. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the key. The moment my fingers closed around it, the world shattered. The lanterns blinked out, plunging the room into darkness. The walls groaned and splintered, and the ground beneath me gave way. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the elevator. The doors opened to the lobby, and the world outside seemed blissfully normal. People walked by, the sounds of traffic and distant conversations drifting in through the open doors. But the key was still in my hand, and when I looked into the mirrored walls of the elevator, my reflection wasn't alone. When I was 6, my mother told me not to feed the wind. It was one of those odd instructions she gave without explanation, her tone so matter-of-fact that I didn't think to question it. "Never leave anything for it," she'd said, tying my scarf tightly around my neck as the autumn gales howled outside. Not food, not coins, not even crumbs. To me, it was just another strange rule, like not picking at scabs or not standing too close to the microwave. But years later, when I was old enough to question things, I realized she never told me why. I grew up in a house at the edge of the woods, where the trees seemed to lean in just a little too far, their roots twisting like they were clawing at the earth to stay grounded. The wind was always louder there, as if it were alive, prowling through the branches and brushing against the windows with a persistence that made the whole house shiver. On the morning of my 12th birthday, I broke my mother's rule. It wasn't intentional. I'd been rushing to leave for school, my mind on the spelling test I hadn't studied for, and the cupcakes I'd begged her to bake for my class. I barely noticed the crust of toast that slipped from my lunch bag and landed on the porch. By the time I saw it, the wind had already claimed it, lifting it off the ground and carrying it into the trees. It wasn't until I got home that I realized something had changed. The air in the house was still. Too still. My mother, usually bustling around the kitchen or humming softly to herself, was standing in the middle of the living room, staring out the window. Her hands were clenched tightly at her sides, and her reflection in the glass looked wrong, like it didn't quite match her posture. "Did you leave something outside?" she asked, her voice low and tight. I hesitated. It was just a piece of toast. She turned to me then, her face pale and sharp. her eyes shining with something between anger and fear. "Go to your room," she said. I didn't argue. That night, the wind came for me. It started with the sound, a low whistle that grew into a chorus of groans and wails as the trees bent and the windows rattled. I pulled the covers over my head, but the noise seeped through, pressing against my ears like it was trying to whisper secrets into my skull. And then it knocked. 3 sharp taps on the window, deliberate and measured. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. The figure outside wasn't human. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid, like the flicker of a flame in a breeze. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a swirl of shadow and light, constantly shifting, never settling. But its eyes, pale and steady, held me in place. It raised a hand, its fingers curling into a beckoning motion, and the glass fogged over where its palm brushed the surface. "Come outside," it whispered, though its voice didn't pass through my ears. It was in my head, soft and insistent, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't move. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of earth and rain, as if the wind had brought the forest with it. Then I heard my mother's voice, faint but clear, calling from the hallway. "Don't open the window," she said, "no matter what it offers you." The figure's swirling face seemed to falter for a moment, its edges flickering like a weak signal. But it didn't leave. Instead, it pressed its face closer to the glass, the swirling shadows growing darker, more frantic. "It's lonely," it whispered. "So lonely." The knock came again, louder this time, the glass trembling under its force. I covered my ears and shut my eyes, but the whispering didn't stop. By the time morning came, the figure was gone, but the forest outside the window was different. The trees were closer, their branches brushing against the side of the house like fingers testing the strength of the walls. I told my mother what had happened, and her face went tight and pale again. She handed me a silver coin, its surface smooth and cool. "Keep this with you," she said. "If it comes back, don't speak to it. Don't look at it. Just hold this and wait." I didn't understand, but I obeyed. The figure did come back, night after night, always at the window, always whispering. It offered me things, promises of secrets, gifts I couldn't imagine, answers to questions I didn't even know I had. Each time, I held the coin and waited. Over time, the figure grew angrier. Its whispers turned to hisses, its knocks to pounding, until the glass seemed ready to shatter. But no matter how loud it grew, it couldn't get in. The last time I saw it, it wasn't alone. There were others now, their shapes flickering like leaves caught in a storm. They circled the house, their pale eyes glowing in the dark, and the whispers became a cacophony, a storm of voices crashing against the walls. My mother lit candles in every window and placed a bowl of salt by the front door. She didn't say anything, but I saw the strain in her face, the way her hands shook as she worked. When dawn finally came, the figures were gone. I left home a few years later, but I never forgot the wind. I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments before a storm, whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. And I never feed it. The clock in my grandfather's workshop had been stuck at 3:33 for as long as I could remember. As a kid, I used to sit in the corner and watch him work, the rhythmic tap of his tools filling the silence while that clock loomed on the wall. "It's broken," he'd said whenever I asked. "One of those things I've been meaning to fix." But he never did. When he passed, the house, and everything in it, became mine. I wasn't ready for the responsibility, but it wasn't like I had much of a choice. Clearing out decades of memories was overwhelming, so I avoided the workshop for as long as I could. That space felt like it still belonged to him, even though the rest of the house had already begun to feel hollow. One rainy afternoon, unable to avoid it any longer, I finally went in. The workshop smelled exactly as I remembered: sawdust, engine oil, and a faint trace of pipe tobacco. Tools hung neatly on the walls, their outlines drawn in pencil on the wooden paneling. Jars of nails and screws lined the shelves, their contents meticulously sorted. But it was the clock that drew my attention, just as it had when I was a child. 3:33. Its hands were frozen in place, the face faded and cracked. But as I stared at it, I realized something was off. It wasn't the time itself, it was the sound. The clock was ticking. I leaned in closer, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the glass. It ticked steadily, the kind of sound that seemed to fill the room without echoing. But the hands didn't move. Curious, I took the clock down from the wall. It was heavier than I expected, the wood frame smooth and warm against my palms. Turning it over, I found a small latch holding the back panel in place. I flipped it open, expecting to see old gears or springs. Instead, I found a piece of folded paper. It was tucked into the mechanism, yellowed with age and fragile to the touch. Carefully, I unfolded it, revealing a short message written in my grandfather's unmistakable hand. Do not win the clock, no matter what. I stared at the note, a chill creeping up my spine. There was no explanation, no context, just that single warning. I set the clock aside and tried to focus on cleaning. But the ticking was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a constant pressure in the back of my mind, urging me to act. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, yet I couldn't bring myself to leave the workshop. At some point, my curiosity got the better of me. The clock's winding mechanism was intact, a small brass key still inserted into the hole. It wouldn't hurt to try, I reasoned. The note had to be a joke, one of my grandfather's eccentricities. I turned the key. The clock's hands jerked forward. Once, twice. Then they spun, moving so fast they became a blur. The ticking grew louder, deeper, reverberating through the room like a heartbeat. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the room remained still. The clock's hands now pointed to midnight, and the ticking had ceased entirely. Relieved, I laughed at my own paranoia and started to put the clock back on the wall. That's when I noticed the window. It was dark outside, but the glass was no longer reflecting the faint glow of the workshop's light. Instead, it showed something else entirely. A forest. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches twisting like veins against a starless sky. A faint mist curled between the trunks, shifting unnaturally, as though moved by something unseen. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the glass. The forest wasn't just in the window, it was moving. The trees swayed without wind, the mist creeping closer to the pane. And then I saw them. Figures, barely visible, blending into the shadows between the trees. They moved with a deliberate slowness, their forms elongated and wrong. As I watched, one of them turned its head, and though its face was hidden, I knew it was looking directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the workbench. The figures didn't move closer, but their presence pressed against the room like a weight. The clock began ticking again, but the sound was different now. It wasn't steady, it was erratic, like footsteps on uneven ground. I grabbed the clock, desperate to stop it, but the hands moved backward, spinning wildly as the ticking grew louder. The figures in the window pressed closer, their shapes flickering like candle flames. The workshop began to change. The walls stretched and groaned, the wood darkening and twisting as though the room itself were being swallowed. The tools on the walls clattered to the floor, their edges rusted and jagged. And then the window shattered. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The forest was no longer confined to the glass. It was here, surrounding me. The figures stepped into the room, their movements smooth and unnatural, their faces blank and featureless. One of them raised a hand, long and clawed, and pointed at the clock. I understood, somehow. The clock was a doorway, a boundary between this world and whatever lay beyond. I had broken it. I did the only thing I could think of. I smashed the clock. The moment the wood splintered, the room collapsed around me. The figures vanished, the forest receded, and I was left sitting on the cold, damp floor of the workshop. The clock was gone. The next morning, I boarded up the workshop and locked the door. I've tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the faint smell of damp earth lingers in the air, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear the ticking. The diner on Route 57 wasn't the kind of place you stopped unless you were desperate. Hungry, lost, or both. The neon sign that flickered above the roof had lost its fight with the years, leaving only the faintest glow of the letters LEY to suggest it once proudly read Valleys. Inside, the vinyl booths were cracked, the jukebox hadn't worked since the 80s, and the coffee tasted faintly of regret. None of that stopped the place from being crowded on a Friday night. Locals came out of habit, drifters because there was nowhere else. Claire sat in the corner booth, the farthest one from the door, the way she always did. It was late, later than she should have been out, but she wasn't ready to go home yet. The house would be dark and quiet, and she couldn't stomach either tonight. The waitress, B, gave her the same tired smile as always, refilling her coffee without asking. "Anything else, hon?" BEA's voice had the rough edge of someone who'd been smoking too long and listening too much. "No," Claire said. "This is fine." She didn't touch the coffee. The mug was warm against her hands, and that was enough. A man walked in. The bell above the door jingled faintly, but it might as well have been a gunshot in the room's thick lull of conversation. He wasn't local. Claire could tell by the way his eyes scanned the room, taking in every face with quiet precision. His clothes were simple, a dark coat, scuffed boots, but there was a sharpness to him, a kind of presence that made her sit up straighter without realizing it. He didn't head for the counter or one of the open booths. He came straight to her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. His face was hard to pin down, unremarkable but memorable in a way she couldn't explain. His eyes, though, they were sharp, the color of steel on a cold morning. Claire glanced around the room, hoping for an excuse, but no one was paying attention. She gestured toward the seat across from her, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet certainty that he wouldn't leave even if she said no. "Thanks," he said, sliding into the booth. He didn't take off his coat. They sat in silence for a moment. He passed by, raising an eyebrow at Claire as if to ask if everything was okay. Claire gave her a small nod. The man didn't order anything, didn't look at the menu. He folded his hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, and said, "You're Claire, right?" The question hit her like a cold gust of wind. Her name sounded strange coming from him, like he wasn't used to saying it. She tried to keep her face neutral. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," he said, the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "But I know you." Her pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "Is this some kind of scam? If you're selling something, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything," he said, his tone light but firm. "I'm here because of the box." Her heart sank. The box. She had hoped, no, convinced herself, that it was nothing. Just a strange little thing she'd found in her grandmother's attic last month, tucked away in a pile of yellowed newspapers. It was small, wooden, with a latch that refused to open no matter how much she fiddled with it. She'd taken it home out of curiosity, but hadn't been able to bring herself to throw it away. "How do you know about the box?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Because you shouldn't have it," he said simply. "And you definitely shouldn't have opened it." Her breath caught. "I didn't. It's locked." His expression darkened. "Not anymore." A chill ran through her. "What are you talking about?" "Claire." He leaned closer, his voice low but insistent. "The box opens when it's ready. Not when you want it to, not when you try. When it's ready. And it's open now." "I don't believe you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She thought about the box, sitting on her dresser at home. She thought about the way it had felt heavier lately, as though it were holding something inside it that hadn't been there before. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" the man continued, his eyes locked on hers. "The way the air feels thicker around it. The way time seems to slip, just a little, when you're near it. That's how it starts." Her stomach churned. She had noticed. She hadn't wanted to admit it, even to herself, but she'd noticed. The box was wrong. It had always been wrong. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharper now, tinged with fear. "To help," he said. "But I can only do that if you give it to me." "Why would I do that?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You show up out of nowhere, tell me some vague nonsense about how I shouldn't have the box, and I'm just supposed to hand it over?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. Because keeping it is worse. Much worse. Before she could respond, the lights in the diner flickered. A low hum filled the air, so faint she might have thought she imagined it if she hadn't seen the way the man's face tightened. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "They're here," he said. "Who's here?" she asked, rising to her feet, though her legs felt unsteady. "Not who," he said, pulling a small, intricately carved object from his coat pocket. It glinted faintly, its surface etched with patterns that made her head hurt to look at. "What?" The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls. The other diners didn't seem to notice. They continued their conversations, their laughter, oblivious to the growing tension that made Claire's skin crawl. "We need to leave," the man said, his voice tight. "Now." "What's happening?" she demanded, her heart racing. He turned to her, and for the first time, his calm facade cracked. His eyes were hard, desperate. "You opened the box, Claire, and now something's trying to come through." Before she could argue, the hum shattered into a sharp, piercing sound, and the air itself seemed to split. The room tilted, the light bending in impossible angles, and in the corner of her eye, she saw something move. Not a person, not an object, something vast, shifting, and utterly wrong. The man grabbed her wrist. "Run." It was a sound that woke me, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I lay there in the dark, frozen, straining to hear it again. But the silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that made the air feel thicker, heavier, as if something was listening back. I told myself it had been a dream. The next morning, everything felt slightly misaligned. My apartment was as I had left it, but the details were wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. My toothbrush was in the wrong cup. The rug in the living room had shifted by an inch, maybe two. Small things, easily dismissible. I was groggy, still shaken by the strange hum that now felt like a distant memory. As I left for work, I noticed the mirror in the hallway. It was fogged, though the air was dry. A single word was traced into the haze, letters sharp and deliberate. "Come." I froze. It hadn't been there the night before, and I lived alone. My heart raced, and I forced myself to wipe the mirror clean with my sleeve. The word vanished, but the unease lingered. At work, I tried to bury myself in emails and deadlines, but my mind kept drifting. The hum, the mirror, the shifting objects. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was tired, stressed, distracted. By lunch, I'd almost convinced myself. Almost. That night, the hum came again, louder this time. It vibrated through my body, a low, steady pulse that seemed to resonate with my bones. I sat up in bed, clutching the blankets, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. My room was pitch black, the silence oppressive. And then I saw it. The mirror in the hallway glowed faintly, its surface shimmering as though it were underwater. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding, and stepped toward it. The glow pulsed gently, beckoning. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The edges of my face blurred, and my eyes seemed darker, deeper, like there was something vast and unknowable behind them. My reflection tilted its head. I didn't. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and grabbed my phone, snapping a picture of the mirror in a panic. The glow vanished the second I pressed the shutter. My reflection returned to normal, wide-eyed and pale. The photo was blank. The next day, I stayed home, locking every door and window, though I wasn't sure what I was trying to keep out. The mirror remained dull and ordinary, but I avoided it anyway, glancing at it only out of the corner of my eye. By evening, I was beginning to feel foolish. The day had passed without incident, and the hum was absent. Maybe it had all been in my head. I poured myself a glass of wine, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. That's when the lights went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the glow of the TV flickering once before dying completely. I grabbed my phone, using the screen as a makeshift flashlight, and stumbled toward the breaker box. The hum returned. It was deafening now, a deep vibration that rattled the walls and set my teeth on edge. I froze, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The sound grew louder, and then I saw the light. It was coming from the mirror. This time, the glow was brighter, pulsing erratically, casting strange shadows across the walls. My reflection was gone. In its place was a black void, an expanse so vast it made me feel like I was falling. The hum grew louder still, and then, faintly, I heard a voice. Come. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a demand. It was a simple statement, low and resonant, spoken with the certainty of something that had already decided. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The mirror shimmered, the void rippling like the surface of a pond. Something was moving inside it. A hand emerged, long and pale, its fingers impossibly thin. It reached out, pressing against the glass, which rippled and bent under its touch. Another hand followed, and then a face, sharp and angular, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. The thing stared at me, its gaze piercing, and then it smiled. You're late. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, and scrambled to my feet. The thing in the mirror didn't move, but its smile widened, and the glass began to crack. Thin fractures spread across the surface, light spilling through them like molten metal. The hum grew louder, deafening, and then the mirror shattered. The silence that followed was complete. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was gone. Not broken, gone. The wall where it had hung was bare, the surface smooth, as though the mirror had never existed. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was over. The hum didn't return. The glow didn't reappear. But every time I passed by where the mirror had been, I felt it. The pull of the void, faint but undeniable, like a door left ajar. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear it again. A voice, low and resonant, speaking from somewhere just out of reach. You're still late. I didn't think much of the new clock at first. My sister had dropped it off one afternoon, unannounced, with her usual chaotic energy. You'll love it, she'd said, brushing off my protests. It's vintage, like you always wanted. A housewarming gift. Before I could argue, she set it on the mantel, gave me a quick hug, and disappeared back to her car, leaving me staring at it. It was a grandfather clock, smaller than most, with a deep cherry wood frame and a glass face that gleamed even in the low light of my living room. The pendulum was ornate, etched with intricate swirls and symbols that didn't quite make sense when I tried to focus on them. I wound it once, mostly out of curiosity. The clockwork began to tick-tock in steady rhythm, a sound that quickly faded into the background of my life. I just moved into the house, a tiny, crooked thing on the edge of town, bought cheap because no one else wanted to deal with its peeling wallpaper and leaky pipes, and the clock seemed to fit the vibe. It was old, out of place, but comforting in a way. At least, at first. The changes were subtle. It started with the ticking. After a week, it began to sound off. Not broken or uneven, just not quite right. The rhythm seemed to stretch and compress, like it was keeping time for something that wasn't my world. I'd pause in the kitchen or stop halfway up the stairs, swearing it had skipped a beat, only for it to resume its steady cadence as if mocking me. I told myself it was just my imagination, an overreaction to the silence of living alone for the first time. But then the hands began to move differently. I'd leave the room for what felt like 5 minutes, only to return and see the clock had advanced an hour. Other times, I'd glance at it after a long evening, only to find it stubbornly stuck at the same minute as when I'd last looked. It was never consistent. My phone or wristwatch would tell me one thing, but the clock always had its own idea. My sister laughed when I called to complain. Of course it's weird, she said. That's why it's charming. Stop overthinking everything. One night, I woke up to the sound of it chiming. Not the usual soft tones it had during the day, but something heavier, deeper, that vibrated through the floorboards. The hand showed midnight, but my phone read 3:14 a.m. I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at it from across the room, half expecting it to stop. Instead, the pendulum swung harder than I'd ever seen, cutting the air like a metronome on the verge of breaking. After 5 chimes, it fell silent, the pendulum freezing mid-swing. When I stepped closer, The etched swirls seemed deeper somehow, the symbols sharper. I didn't touch it. I went back to bed with the covers pulled tight around me, pretending I hadn't seen anything. The next morning, the clock was normal again, the pendulum moving in its lazy arc. But something was wrong with the house. The air felt heavier, like the walls were pressing inward just enough to make me notice. The light coming through the windows seemed colder, drained of color. The smell of wood polish and lemon cleaner that I'd been using to fix up the place was replaced with a faint metallic tang that clung to everything. I cleaned compulsively that day, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I returned from running errands that evening, I found the front door unlocked. I knew I'd locked it. I double-checked every time I left. My stomach sank as I stepped inside, calling out, half hoping someone would answer just so I wouldn't feel crazy. No one did. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, except for the clock. Its face was blank now, the hands gone, the pendulum motionless. I reached for my phone, intending to take a picture, but when I looked up again, the hands were back, ticking calmly towards 6:12. My hand trembled as I locked the door behind me. Things escalated quickly after that. Shadows that shouldn't have been there appeared in the corners of rooms, shifting when I turned my head. The sound of the clock filled the house even when I was upstairs with the doors shut, its rhythm echoing in my chest like a second heartbeat. I began to dream of it, always the same image. The pendulum swinging back and forth, carving thin, glowing lines into the air until the symbols etched into its brass face appeared around me, forming a circle I couldn't escape. The air in the dreams was suffocating, thick with something that felt like malice. One night, the clock chimed 13 times. I'd been sitting in the kitchen, staring at the half-eaten dinner on my plate, when the first chime rang out. I counted each one, my breath catching in my throat as the number climbed past 12. By the 13th chime, the room was pitch black, the overhead light flickering once before going out completely. I sat frozen in the dark, the only sound the faint whisper of the pendulum swinging again. The whispers started the next day. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, faint voices brushing against the edges of my hearing. But they grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out fragments. My name, snatches of phrases I didn't recognize, words in a language that scraped against my ears like rusted metal. They came from the clock, I was sure of it. Standing in front of it felt like standing in a room full of people I couldn't see, their voices overlapping in a growing cacophony. I called my sister. I don't know what I expected her to do, but I needed to tell someone. She didn't answer. Instead, her voicemail played, her voice distant and hollow. Behind it, faint but unmistakable, I heard the same ticking that haunted my house. I hung up before the beep. That night, the symbols on the pendulum weren't just etched. They glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the ticking. I tried to stop it. I wrapped the pendulum in towels, jammed the gears with a kitchen knife, even threw the entire thing onto its back. But it didn't stop. The pendulum swung in defiance of gravity, the symbols burning brighter with every swing. The air in the room grew oppressive, and the whispers turned to laughter. Cold, joyless laughter that echoed long after I fled to the bedroom. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I hauled the clock into the yard, my hands trembling as I dragged it over the uneven ground. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and swung, the sound of wood splintering filling the air. But even as I shattered the frame, the ticking continued, loud and clear, like it was coming from inside me. When I finally gave up, the clock lay in pieces around me, its face intact despite the violence. The symbols were no longer etched into the pendulum. They floated above it now, spinning lazily in the air like embers. I left that day, the house and the clock abandoned to whatever I'd woken. But sometimes, when I'm sitting alone, I'll hear it again. The ticking, slow and steady, growing louder as the symbols begin to form in the edges of my vision. The man at the bus stop wasn't strange at first. I saw him every morning, standing just a few feet from the bench, always wearing the same dark coat and scarf. He'd nod politely if I glanced his way, and that was the extent of our interaction. He carried no bag, had no visible phone, and never boarded the bus. I assumed he was waiting for someone, or maybe he just enjoyed the early mornings. It wasn't until the fourth or fifth time I saw him that I realized something odd. His coat never changed. The same small tear near the left pocket, the same thin layer of frost dusting the shoulders, no matter the weather. Even his stance never shifted. Hands tucked into his coat, head tilted slightly as if he were watching for something just over the horizon. I told myself I was overthinking it. People are creatures of habit, after all. But then, one morning, he nodded before I looked at him. It was subtle, a small dip of his head, almost imperceptible, but it came before I turned toward him, before my brain had even decided to acknowledge his presence. My stomach tightened. Maybe he'd caught my reflection in the glass of the bus shelter. Maybe he'd guessed. Still, it stuck with me. The following day, I decided not to look at him at all. I stared straight ahead, hands jammed into my pockets, refusing to glance his way. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught him nodding. Not at me, at something or someone, just behind me. I spun around, but the street was empty. After that, the bus stop became an obsession. I started leaving earlier and earlier, hoping to arrive before him, to catch him walking up or adjusting his coat. But no matter how early I got there, he was already in place, standing in that same quiet, immovable way, staring at the same distant point. On a Saturday morning, when the bus wouldn't even be running, I walked to the stop out of pure curiosity. The air was cold, the kind of chill that bites at your fingertips and makes your breath hang in thick clouds. The street was empty, no traffic, no pedestrians. For the first time, the bench was clear and the man wasn't there. I almost laughed at myself for expecting him, but then I saw it. A set of footprints in the frost, leading to his usual spot. Fresh, precise, and impossibly neat. They stopped abruptly, just a few feet from the bench, as though he'd been plucked out of existence mid-step. I followed them, my breath catching in my throat. When I reached the end, I felt it. The air was different, denser. A faint vibration thrummed against my skin, like standing too close to a running generator. The sensation was strongest in the exact spot where he always stood. I don't know what possessed me to stay there. Maybe I thought I'd feel closer to solving the mystery, or maybe it was something else, a pull, a quiet compulsion to wait. So, I stood there, staring at the empty street, shivering as the cold seeped through my jacket. I don't remember closing my eyes. When I opened them, the street was gone. I was standing in a vast, gray expanse, stretching endlessly in all directions. There was no sky, no ground, just an overwhelming sense of space and nothingness. The air was still, unnaturally so, and the only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of something enormous and unseen. I turned, trying to orient myself, but there was no reference point. No landmarks, no shadows, nothing to suggest where I'd come from. Then I saw him, the man from the bus stop. He was standing just ahead, his coat and scarf exactly as they had always been, but his face was different now, sharper, more defined, as if the haze that had always surrounded him had been stripped away. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw recognition there. "You shouldn't have followed," he said, his voice low and calm. "Where am I?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He didn't reply. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements deliberate but not threatening. "You saw it, didn't you? The space where I stand. You felt it." I nodded, unsure of what else to do. He sighed, a sound that carried more weight than I could comprehend. "There are places in your world," he said, "where the fabric is thinner, where what separates here from there wears away." He gestured to the gray expanse around us. "This is one of those places. And now, you've brought yourself through." I swallowed hard. "How do I get back?" He tilted his head, considering me. "Do you know what it costs to return?" "No," I whispered. "Good," he said. "You shouldn't." He extended a hand. His palm was pale, almost translucent, like light shining through paper. I hesitated but took it. The hum grew louder, the vibrations coursing through my body until I thought I might shatter. The gray expanse folded in on itself, collapsing into a single point of light that burned brighter and brighter until I was back at the bus stop. The man was gone, and the street was alive again with the sounds of passing cars and chatter from the cafe across the road. My chest heaved, and I looked down at my hands, half expecting them to be pale and translucent like his. They weren't. I haven't seen the man since that day, but I avoid the bus stop now. I walk an extra 3 blocks to a different one, though I know it doesn't matter. Because sometimes, late at night, I still feel it. The air, dense and humming, like a string stretched too tightly. And when I close my eyes, I see him standing there, waiting, nodding at something just beyond the horizon. I used to work late nights at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The kind of place with sticky menus, flickering neon lights, and a clientele that shifted between truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional drifter. The tips weren't great, but I liked the rhythm of the nights, the hum of the coffee machine, the clatter of dishes, the way the quiet hours made time feel elastic. One night, just after 2 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall, wearing a long gray coat that seemed too thin for the cold. His face was sharp and angular, but it wasn't his features that struck me, it was his eyes. They were pale, almost colorless, and they seemed to absorb the light, like they were pulling something out of the room. He slid into a booth near the back, far from the other customers, and sat with his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't glance at the menu, didn't look at his phone, just sat there, perfectly still, staring at the wall. "Coffee?" I asked, approaching him with my notepad. "Yes, please," he said, his voice low and measured, like he was careful with every word. "Anything else?" "Not yet." He smiled faintly, and I noticed his teeth were almost too white, like they didn't belong in his face. I poured him a cup and left him alone. He didn't touch the coffee, just sat there, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. By 3 a.m., the diner was almost empty, and the man hadn't moved. He hadn't even blinked, as far as I could tell. It was unsettling, but I told myself it wasn't my business. We got all kinds in there, and most of them had stories they didn't want to tell. Then he started humming. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible at first, like he was testing it out, but it grew louder, filling the empty diner with a low, eerie melody that seemed to reverberate in my chest. It wasn't a tune I recognized, and it didn't have a rhythm I could follow, just a series of haunting, uneven notes. "Sir?" I asked, approaching cautiously. "Everything okay?" He stopped humming and looked up at me. For the first time, his gaze felt like it was on me, and it sent a chill down my spine. "It's a beautiful night," he said, tilting his head slightly. "It's cold," I replied, unsure of what else to say. He smiled again, but this time it felt wrong. Not forced, exactly, but like it was there for a different reason than I assumed. "You don't hear it, do you?" he asked. "Hear what?" "The sound." He tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "It's coming for you." I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. "Okay, sir, I think you've had enough coffee." He laughed, a soft, hollow sound that didn't match his expression. "I haven't even touched it." And he was right. The coffee was still full, steam curling faintly from the cup. "Look," I said, my voice shaky, "if you're trying to scare me, it's not funny. I'll have to ask you to leave." "I'll leave," he said, standing slowly, "but it won't make a difference." He pulled something from his coat pocket and set it on the table. It was a key, old and heavy, the kind you'd see in a movie about haunted castles. Without another word, he walked out into the night, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. I stared at the key, unsure if I should pick it up or leave it alone. Eventually, curiosity won. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, and when I turned it over in my hand, I saw a small inscription etched into the metal, "For what you've forgotten." The words sent a shiver through me, though I couldn't say why. I slipped the key into my pocket, planning to show it to my manager in the morning. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but the key weighed on me, its presence too heavy for something so small. When I finally got home, I set it on my nightstand and tried to sleep, but my dreams were restless. I dreamed of locked doors and endless hallways, of a strange, hollow melody humming just out of reach. When I woke, the key was gone. I searched everywhere, my bed, the floor, even my pockets, but it had vanished. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I heard the humming. It was faint, coming from somewhere outside. I opened my window, expecting to see someone on the street, but the sound didn't come from there. It seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder as the day went on. By nightfall, it was unbearable. I tried to drown it out with music, with TV, but nothing worked. The sound burrowed into my mind, relentless and inescapable. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It was words, whispered and fragmented. You forgot. You locked it away. It's time. I don't know how I ended up back at the diner. The streets blurred as I walked, the world around me fading into shadow. When I reached the booth where the man had sat, the key was there, waiting for me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up, and the humming stopped. Now I hear something else. The soft click of a lock turning, the creak of a door opening. I don't know where it leads. I only know I have to follow. The train station didn't have a name. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled into the tiny parking lot late that night. The building was small, more of a shack than a station, and the sign above the platform simply read, "Departures." No destination listed, no arrivals board, just that one word, painted in faded black letters that seemed to absorb the weak light of the overhead lamps. I wouldn't have stopped if my car hadn't broken down a mile back. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving me stranded on a lonely stretch of road. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was a good 20 miles away. Then, through the fog and the dark, I'd spotted the faint glow of the station's lights. A lucky break, I'd thought at the time. Inside, the air was cool and stale, carrying the faint smell of dust and engine oil. The waiting room was empty, save for a single wooden bench and a ticket counter. A clock hung above the counter, its hands frozen at 9:14. A man sat behind the glass, his head bowed as if studying something in his lap. He didn't look up as I approached. "Excuse me," I said, tapping the counter. "Do you have a phone I can use? My car broke down." The man raised his head slowly, revealing a gaunt face and hollow eyes. His uniform was crisp but outdated, like something from the 1940s, and his name tag simply read attendant. "We don't have a phone," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "But there's a train arriving soon." "A train? At this hour?" I glanced at the dusty schedule board on the wall. It was blank, the columns of times and destinations empty. He nodded once. "They always come, eventually." I should have left then, walked back to my car, and waited for daylight. But something about the man's tone kept me rooted to the spot. "How do I get to the next town?" I asked. The attendant tilted his head, as if I'd asked a question with no answer. "There's nothing past here," he said simply. Before I could respond, a low rumble shook the floor. The sound grew steadily louder, accompanied by the distant screech of metal on metal. A train was coming. I turned toward the platform, my breath fogging in the cold air. The locomotive emerged from the darkness, its headlights cutting through the fog. It wasn't like any train I'd ever seen. The engine was massive, its surface slick with something that glistened in the light. The windows of the passenger cars were opaque, reflecting the dim glow of the station. The train hissed to a stop, and the doors slid open. The platform remained empty. No passengers got off. "You should board," the attendant said behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering. "What? Why? I just need a phone." "This is your train," he interrupted. His voice had a finality to it, like he wasn't offering advice but issuing a command. The door to the nearest car stood open, waiting. Warm air wafted out, carrying a faint smell of ozone and something sweeter, like burned sugar. "I'm not getting on," I said, backing away. The attendant's hollow eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment, I saw something behind them. Something vast and empty, like the blackness between stars. "You already bought your ticket," he said softly. I didn't remember buying a ticket. I didn't even know this station existed before tonight. But as I looked down, my hand was holding something. A slip of thick, yellowed paper with jagged edges. Admit 1, departures. My breath caught. I didn't know how it had gotten there, but the paper was warm, almost pulsing in my hand. The rumble of the train deepened, vibrating through the platform. "Go," the attendant said. I turned back to the train. The air felt heavy now, pressing against my chest, and I realized the fog wasn't outside the station anymore. It had crept in, swirling around my ankles, climbing higher with each passing second. The sweetness in the air grew cloying, almost suffocating. The open door beckoned. I don't know why I stepped forward. Maybe it was the pull of the ticket in my hand, or the way the fog seemed to thicken behind me, closing off any escape. Maybe it was the realization that the attendant's face wasn't reflected in the glass of his booth anymore, just empty darkness where he should have been. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the door slid shut behind me. The train jolted, lurching forward with a grinding screech. I staggered, catching myself on one of the metal poles lining the aisle. The interior was pristine, polished wood paneling, velvet seats, and golden light spilling from antique sconces. But the windows were still opaque, and the passengers, if they could be called that, weren't moving. They sat in perfect rows, their faces hidden behind wide-brimmed hats and veils, their hands gloved and folded neatly in their laps. None of them turned to look at me, but I could feel their awareness, like the static charge in the air before a storm. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The faces I could see were blank, featureless, like mannequins. Others were turned just enough to remain hidden, their forms unnaturally stiff. At the far end of the car, a door led to the next compartment. It opened as I approached, gliding silently aside. Beyond it was a different kind of space entirely. The walls were gone, replaced by an expanse of infinite black. The floor stretched forward into nothingness, a narrow path suspended in the void. And standing at the center of that path was me, or something that looked like me. It turned slowly as I approached, its movements fluid and wrong, like a reflection in rippling water. Its eyes weren't mine, though. They were too wide, too bright, filled with light that burned cold. "You're late," it said in my voice. I froze. The thing smiled, stretching my features too far. "It's been waiting for you." "What has?" My voice trembled, sounding small in the vastness of the space. It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing the end of the path. There, at the edge of the void, was another train. Smaller, darker, its silhouette barely visible against the blackness. Its doors were open, leading into a space so dark it felt like falling just to look at it. You don't have a choice," the thing said, its smile growing sharper. The ticket in my hand burned, searing my skin. The last thing I remember was the sound of the train's whistle, low and mournful, echoing through the emptiness as I stepped forward. When I woke up, I was in my car. The engine started without issue, and the road stretched ahead, bathed in the pale light of dawn. But the ticket was still in my hand, and every time I pass a train station now, I hear the whistle, calling me back. It wasn't until the photographs came back wrong that I realized something was watching me. I've always been an amateur photographer. Landscapes, candid street shots, the occasional artsy attempt at still life. Nothing groundbreaking, just a hobby I indulged when work wasn't too demanding. The camera was an old one, handed down from my dad, the kind that required film and careful attention to lighting. That day, I'd spent the afternoon hiking through the woods near my new house, snapping pictures of gnarled tree roots, sun-dappled clearings, and the occasional wildflower. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that soaks into your skin and calms you in ways you don't quite notice until later. The strange thing happened after I developed the film. In every photograph, there was a figure in the background. It wasn't obvious at first. In the shot of the stream, for example, it was just a faint blur among the trees, almost like a trick of the light. In another, a photo of a mossy boulder, there was a shadow that hadn't been there when I framed the shot. But as I went through the photos, the figure became clearer. A tall shape, just slightly out of focus, standing in the same position no matter where the picture was taken. It was always facing the camera, though its features were too blurred to make out. Its proportions seemed wrong. Arms too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. At first, I thought it was a flaw in the film. Old cameras have their quirks, and double exposures weren't unheard of. But as I stared at the photographs, unease began to creep over me. The figure was too consistent, too deliberate. And in the last photo, it wasn't in the background anymore. The shot was of a trail winding through the woods, the kind of serene, idyllic scene that looks good on postcards. But the figure was standing in the middle of the path, close enough that its outline was sharp. It was facing me. I couldn't explain it. I'd been alone the entire hike. I was sure of it. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't constant, more like a prickling at the back of my neck when I was alone. Washing dishes, sitting in my living room, trying to fall asleep. I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing there, but there was never anything. At least, not at first. A week after developing the film, I noticed the first photograph. It was tacked to my fridge, next to a few grocery lists and a postcard from a friend. A picture of the mossy boulder, the one with the faint shadow in the background. I hadn't put it there. My stomach tightened. I pulled the photo off the fridge, staring at it as though it might offer an explanation. The shadow in the background seemed darker now, more defined, and I swore I could make out the faint curve of a head, a shoulder. I threw it in the trash. The next morning, it was back on the fridge. This time, it wasn't alone. 2 more photographs had joined it. The shot of the stream, with the faint blur among the trees, and another I didn't recognize. It was a picture of my living room. My breath caught in my throat. The angle was low, taken from somewhere near the floor, as though whoever, or whatever, had taken it was crouching. The room was dimly lit, and in the corner, barely visible, was the same figure. I searched the entire house, every closet, every corner, every shadow. The doors were locked, the windows latched. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of forced entry. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, there were more photographs. They were scattered throughout the house now, on my kitchen counter, on the bathroom sink, even on my pillow. Each one was closer, the figure more distinct. Its limbs were impossibly long. Its head tilted at a sharp angle that made my stomach churn. In one photograph, I was in the frame. I was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer, completely unaware of the figure standing in the doorway behind me. I tried to leave that day, packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the door. But when I opened it, there was a photograph taped to the outside. It was of me, standing at the door, staring at the photograph. My hands trembled as I peeled it off, my pulse pounding in my ears. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know how to stop it. All I knew was that the figure was getting closer. That night, I heard the camera click. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from somewhere inside the house. I sat frozen in my bed, gripping the edge of the blanket as though it could protect me. The darkness pressed in around me, thick and suffocating, until the sound came again. Click. Closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The next morning, I found the final photograph. It was on the floor at the foot of my bed, face down. My hands shook as I picked it up, turning it over. It was a picture of me, taken from the side, lying in bed with my eyes squeezed shut. And just behind me, its face inches from mine, was the figure. I don't take photographs anymore. I hadn't seen Caleb in over 15 years when he sent me a message on social media. It was brief, just a single line. Come back to the lake. There's something you need to see. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. Caleb had never been the kind of person to reach out, especially not with something cryptic like this. But the longer I stared at the message, the more the past started pressing in, sharp and insistent. The lake wasn't just a place. It was the place where we spent every summer as kids, where we first learned how to skip stones and bait hooks and tell ghost stories until we scared ourselves into sleepless nights. But it was also where everything ended. I tried to forget about it. About that last summer, about the way Caleb stopped talking to me after it happened, about how I'd left and never gone back. But Caleb's message sat in my inbox like a thorn under my skin. I had to know. 2 days later, I was driving down the winding forest road that led to the lake. The cabin looked exactly the same. Weathered wood, peeling paint, the dock jutting out into the still, dark water. The air was thick with pine and damp earth, a smell so tied to my childhood it made my chest ache. Caleb was waiting for me on the porch, hands shoved into his pockets. He looked older, of course. The sharp angles of his face had softened, and there was a streak of gray in his hair. But his eyes were the same, sharp and restless, like he was always looking past you to something just over your shoulder. "You came," he said, like he hadn't been sure I would. "What's this about, Caleb?" He gestured toward the dock. "Let's talk down there." The water was unnervingly still, the surface like glass. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, painting the trees in hues of gold and orange. But the lake itself looked cold, untouched by the warmth of the day. When we reached the end of the dock, Caleb sat down, his legs dangling over the edge. I stayed standing. "It's about that night," he said finally, his voice low. I felt my stomach knot. "Caleb, I don't..." "Just listen." I sat down reluctantly, keeping a safe distance between us. "You remember the storm, right?" he asked, staring out at the water. How could I forget? The thunder had been so loud it felt like the sky was tearing itself apart. We were 16, invincible in the way teenagers are, and we dared each other to go swimming in the downpour. But it wasn't the storm that haunted me. It was what happened after. "I don't know what you saw," Caleb continued, his voice shaking slightly, "but I know what I did, and I haven't stopped seeing it since." A chill ran down my spine. "Caleb, it was an accident. We shouldn't have been out there in the first place." "That's not what I mean." He turned to look at me, and the desperation in his eyes sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "There was something in the water that night. You know there was." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but the words caught in my throat. Because I did know. I remembered the way the water had felt wrong. Too cold, too heavy, pulling at us like it wanted to drag us down. I remembered the way Caleb's face had gone pale, the way he'd started shouting my name, even though I was right in front of him, and I remembered the scream. A low, guttural sound that didn't come from either of us, echoing out of the depths like something ancient and hungry. "Did you see it?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I saw shadows. Movement, maybe. But it was dark, Caleb. It could have been anything. It wasn't shadows." He stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "I've been coming back here every year, trying to figure out what it was. And last week, I found something." "What do you mean, found?" Instead of answering, he walked to the edge of the dock and pointed. "Out there, near the rocks." I pulled something up. I followed his gaze to the far end of the lake, where the water was darker, deeper. "You're not making any sense," I said, but my voice was shaky. Caleb crouched and opened a battered tackle box that had been sitting behind him. From inside, he pulled out a jar filled with murky water. Something floated inside. Something small and pale, tangled in strands of greenish black. I leaned closer, squinting. At first, I thought it was a doll's hand. The fingers were too delicate, the skin too smooth. But then I saw the faint webbing between the digits, the translucent claws that tapered to needle-sharp points. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, recoiling. "I don't know," Caleb said, his voice tight. "But it's real. I found it in the same spot where..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the water, "where the third person disappeared." I hadn't thought about him in years. Jared, the neighbor's kid who'd been tagging along with us that summer. He'd been the one to dive first, to shout that he'd seen something glinting at the bottom. He never came back up. "Caleb, we have to report this," I said, my voice shaking. This is evidence. Or a clue or something." I tried. He shoved the jar back into the tackle box. "No one believed me. They said I was crazy, that Jared drowned, and that I'm just obsessed." I stared at him, my mind racing. "And what do you think this proves? That there's some creature in the lake? That it took Jared?" He didn't answer. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the water. "Caleb, we should go," I said, standing, but he didn't move. "Just one more dive," he said quietly. "I have to know for sure." "Are you insane?" Before I could stop him, he stepped off the dock, disappearing into the dark water. "Caleb!" I scrambled to the edge, my heart hammering as I peered into the rippling surface. Seconds passed, then a minute. No bubbles, no movement. And then, finally, something broke the surface. But it wasn't Caleb. It was pale and slick, with eyes that glowed faintly in the fading light. Its mouth opened, rows of jagged teeth glinting as it pulled itself onto the dock, and behind it, the water began to churn. The package arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. There was no knock, no buzz from the delivery driver, just the faint thud of something heavy landing on my front porch. I found it when I stepped out to grab the mail. A box, large and unmarked, sitting dead center on the welcome mat. I live alone. I hadn't ordered anything. The box was plain cardboard, sealed with layers of heavy-duty tape. No return address, no shipping label. Just my name written on the top in thick black marker, the letters slightly smeared, as though written with a shaky hand. I considered leaving it there. A rational voice in my head whispered that it wasn't my problem, that I should call someone, anyone, and let them deal with it. But another part of me, the part that couldn't resist poking at mysteries, overruled the caution. I brought it inside. It was heavier than I expected, its weight solid and unsettling, like a stone pulled from deep water. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, waiting for, I don't know what, a sign? A reason to walk away? When none came, I grabbed a knife and carefully cut the tape. Inside was a single object, a wooden box small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. It was intricately carved, the surface covered in looping patterns and delicate grooves that seemed to shift under the light. There was no latch, no hinges, just a seamless lid that begged to be opened. I hesitated. Something about the box felt wrong. It wasn't fear exactly, more like an instinctual wariness, a sense that whatever was inside wasn't meant for me. But I'd come this far. The lid slid open with a soft click, and I braced myself for something. A sound, a smell, a burst of air. What I got was silence. Inside the box was a single piece of paper, folded neatly into quarters. My hands shook as I unfolded it. 3 words were scrawled across the page in uneven handwriting. Do not look. I laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed in the stillness of the room. It felt like the punchline to a joke I didn't understand, a message meant for someone else. But as I stared at the paper, the laughter faded. There was something about those words, something heavy, something final. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard it. A sound, faint and distant, like footsteps on old wood. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The house was silent again, but the air felt different, charged and brittle, as though the walls were holding something back. I walked through each room, checking the locks, the windows, every shadowed corner. Nothing was out of place, but the unease didn't leave. That night, I dreamed of the box. In the dream, it was larger, filling the center of an endless room with walls that stretched up into darkness. The carvings on its surface glowed faintly, the patterns shifting and writhing like living things. The lid was open, and something inside called to me. Not with words, but with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones. When I woke, the box was on my bedside table. I don't remember bringing it there. I told myself I must have moved it and forgotten. That's what people do, isn't it? Misremember things. Fill in the gaps with explanations that make sense. But the feeling didn't go away. The house wasn't the same after that. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, thicker, as though they were waiting for something. At night, I heard faint whispers, too soft to make out, but persistent enough to keep me awake. And then there was the mirror. It was in the hallway, an antique thing I'd inherited from my grandmother. I'd passed it 100 times without a second thought, but now, whenever I walked by, I felt compelled to stop. The reflection was always the same. My face, pale and tired, staring back at me. But behind me, just at the edge of the frame, was a blur. A shape I couldn't quite make out, as though it was there and not there at the same time. One night, I stood in front of the mirror for hours, watching the shape shift and pulse, my breath fogging the glass. And then it moved. Not the shape, the reflection. My reflection smiled, slow and deliberate, though my lips hadn't moved. I stumbled back, the image in the glass rippling like water, and when I looked again, it was gone. I shoved the mirror into the attic that night, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. If anything, It grew stronger. The box was still on my bedside table. I tried to get rid of it, to leave it out on the curb or throw it in the dumpster. But every time I set it down, I'd find it waiting for me when I got home, as though it had never left. The whispers grew louder. At first, they were just fragments, words I couldn't piece together. But slowly, they became clearer. They spoke of the box, of what was inside, of what would happen if I opened it again. Last night, they said my name. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The box feels heavier now, its presence pressing against me no matter where I go. And the note, the one that said, "Do not look," has changed. This morning, I found it on the floor, the letters smeared and overlapping as though they'd been written in a frenzy. Now it says, "It's already looking." The first sign something was wrong came in the form of an email I didn't remember writing. It was sitting in my drafts folder, dated 2 days ago, addressed to my own inbox. There was no subject line, just a single sentence. "Do not let them inside." At first, I thought it was spam. I even hovered over the delete button, ready to purge it and move on with my day. But then I noticed the sender's name, mine. It wasn't a spoof or a clever fake. It was my exact email address, written from my account. I stared at the screen, trying to recall if I'd written it as some kind of joke or reminder. The thing was, I didn't remember writing it at all. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. A glitch, I thought. A mistake. And then I deleted it. That night, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant, and completely out of place. I live on the top floor of an old apartment building with no working intercom and no one who bothers with unannounced visits. I paused in the kitchen, holding my breath, straining to hear if it would come again. It did. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I moved to the door, my socks soundless against the floor. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Still, my heart hammered in my chest, as though my body knew something I didn't. When the knocks came a third time, I stepped back, my throat tight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer. I didn't open the door. The next morning, I found a note slipped beneath the door. It was folded into a neat square, the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges. Unfolding it revealed a single sentence, scrawled in uneven handwriting that wasn't mine. "You were wise not to answer." I stared at the note, the words imprinting themselves on my mind, and my stomach twisted. I checked the locks twice before leaving for work, convincing myself that this had to be some sort of prank. A neighbor, maybe, someone with a cruel sense of humor. But the note wasn't the last of it. The next day, I found another email. This one didn't appear in my inbox. It was waiting for me on my phone's lock screen, the notification glowing faintly in the early morning light. "They'll try again tonight." The sender was the same. Me. I didn't delete this one. All day at work, I felt like I was being watched. My cubicle felt too small, too exposed, and every time someone passed by, I tensed, expecting, I didn't know what. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, the unease settling in my chest like a stone. I locked the door. I checked the windows. I turned on every light in the apartment, bathing the space in artificial brightness. But when the knocking started, soft, insistent, deliberate, it felt as though the walls were closing in. I didn't answer. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I found another note beneath the door. This one was different. The paper was newer, the handwriting sharper, angrier. "You cannot ignore them forever." The third night, I left the lights off, hoping darkness might make me invisible to whoever, or whatever, was out there. I sat in the kitchen, clutching my phone, waiting, but the knocks didn't come. Instead, there was a new sound, scratching. It started low, a faint scrape against the wood of the door, growing louder and more frantic as the minutes passed. It wasn't the sound of fingernails. It was sharper, harder, like claws raking against the surface. My chest tightened, and I backed away from the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I called the building manager, leaving a shaky voicemail about strange noises and possible break-ins. I didn't expect a reply. By the time the scratching stopped, the door was marred with deep gouges, the wood splintered and raw. Another note was waiting for me, this one taped to the peephole. "You are making it worse." I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it now, pressing against the edges of my reality. The emails started coming more frequently after that. Some were brief warnings, "Don't answer the door." Others were more cryptic, "They're not who they seem." One simply read, "You're running out of time." But the worst was a single attachment, a photo of my door, taken from the hallway outside. I didn't open it. That night, the knocking came again, harder this time, shaking the door on its hinges. The voice that followed was worse. "Let me in," it said. It was soft at first, almost pleading, but as the hours stretched on, the voice grew sharper, angrier. It didn't belong to a person. I don't know how I knew that. I just did. By the time the sun rose, my nerves were frayed to nothing. The door was silent, but I knew better than to trust the quiet. The final email came just before dawn. It was short, almost mocking in its simplicity. "Too late." When I looked at the door, the locks were undone. I don't remember opening them. I don't remember anything after that. But every time I pass a mirror now, I feel like something's wrong. My reflection holds my gaze for too long. My smile doesn't feel quite right. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear it. The soft, deliberate knock. I don't answer, but I think one day I will. The first time I saw the car, it was parked at the edge of my street. A dull, nondescript sedan. Something gray or beige. The kind of vehicle you wouldn't look at twice unless you had a reason to. I only noticed it because I'd never seen it before, and in a neighborhood like mine, new things stood out. It wasn't until the second time I saw it, parked on a different street but close enough to notice, that the thought occurred to me. Was it following me? I dismissed the idea immediately. Paranoia, I told myself. A car is just a car. People park where they want, and no one is watching you. You're not important enough for that. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me when I saw it for the third time. This time near the grocery store where I always shopped. It wasn't parked right next to me, but it was there, tucked near the back of the lot, engine off, windows dark. I decided to test it. On the way home, I turned left where I usually went right, taking a detour through side streets and alleys. When I finally pulled into my driveway, heart pounding, I glanced up and saw nothing. The street was empty. I laughed at myself, shaking my head as I carried my groceries inside, determined to let the whole thing go. People don't get followed in real life. That's the kind of thing you read about in crime novels or watch in late-night thrillers. It wasn't happening to me, but it didn't stop. The car began showing up more often, always on the periphery of my day. At the park where I jogged in the mornings, idling near the far end of the lot. Outside my office building, parked across the street with its headlights off. At first, I avoided looking at it directly, hoping to convince myself it wasn't real. But as the days passed, I couldn't resist. I started searching for it, my eyes scanning parking lots and side streets like a radar, always bracing for the familiar shape to appear. One night, as I walked to my car after a late shift, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't parked. It was moving. The headlights clicked on as I stepped out of the building, the engine rumbling to life. It drove slowly, deliberately, past the lot where I stood. My stomach knotted as I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with sweat. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my heart hammering as I watched the car disappear into the darkness. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just a coincidence, a trick of my overworked mind. But deep down, I knew better. I'd never seen who was inside the car, never even caught a glimpse of a face behind the wheel. That made it worse. My imagination filled in the gaps, painting pictures of shadowy figures and blank-eyed drivers. One evening, determined to put an end to it, I parked my car near the diner down the road, a place that stayed open late and always had a steady trickle of customers. I waited, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. An hour passed, then two, and I started to think I was wrong, that the car wasn't coming. But just as I was about to leave, I saw it. It turned the corner slowly, its headlights sweeping across the parking lot before clicking off. It pulled into a spot a few rows behind me and sat there, engine humming faintly. My throat tightened as I stared at it, willing myself to get out of the car, to walk over and confront whoever was inside. But I couldn't. My hands were glued to the steering wheel, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't explain. After a few minutes, the car's engine went quiet. I held my breath, expecting someone to step out, but the doors stayed shut. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until it became unbearable. I turned the key in the ignition and drove home, my pulse racing the entire way. The car didn't follow me, or if it did, I didn't see it. I barely slept that night. Every noise outside sent me bolt upright, heart pounding, convinced it was the car pulling into my driveway. When morning came, the exhaustion did nothing to dull the anxiety. I went about my day as usual, but every errand, every stop, was marked by the gnawing sense that I wasn't alone. It was a week later, in the early hours of the morning, when I woke to the sound of a car idling. I sat up in bed, the room bathed in the faint glow of my phone's clock. 3:17 a.m. The noise was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the street below. The car was there, parked directly across from my house. For a long moment, I just stared, my mind racing. My phone sat on the nightstand, and I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That a car was parked legally on the street? That I had a bad feeling? They'd laugh me off the line. As I stood there, staring out into the dark, something moved. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, wrapped in a dark coat, their features obscured by shadow. They stood by the car for a moment, their head tilted slightly, as though they were looking at my house. Then, they started walking. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking as I locked the bedroom door and grabbed my phone. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly from outside, growing louder as they neared the porch. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I whispered to the operator, "Someone's outside my house." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then came the knock. Soft, deliberate, 3 times against the front door. I stayed where I was, clutching the phone to my ear as the operator assured me that help was on the way. The knocking didn't come again. By the time the police arrived, the car was gone, and the street was empty. They searched the area, found nothing, and left me with a polite but dismissive warning to stay vigilant. That was 3 days ago. I haven't seen the car since, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see headlights sweeping across the dark. I tell myself it's over, that whoever was in that car has moved on. But deep down, I know better. I first noticed the woman in red on a Sunday afternoon. I was walking home from the park, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and wet leaves. She stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost, her dress a deep crimson that seemed to absorb the light. At first, I thought she was just another pedestrian, someone lost in thought, her face half hidden beneath the wide brim of a black hat. But she wasn't waiting for the light to change. She wasn't looking at her phone or checking her watch. She was looking at me. Her gaze wasn't intense or threatening. It was calm, patient, as though she had been expecting me to notice her. My steps faltered, and I felt the sharp awareness of being seen, as if her gaze had weight. I turned away quickly, pretending to adjust my bag, and when I looked back, she was gone. The lamppost was empty, the street bustling with people who hadn't seemed to notice her at all. That night, I dreamed of her. The dream was fragmented, blurry at the edges. She stood at the end of a long corridor, her red dress vibrant against the dim surroundings. I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the ground, my chest tight. She didn't approach, didn't speak. She just stood there, her hat casting a shadow over her face, and yet I could feel her watching me. I woke up gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. Over the next few days, I began to see her more often. At first, it was fleeting. A glimpse of red in a crowd, the silhouette of a hat disappearing around a corner. Then it became more deliberate. She was standing outside my building when I left for work, her figure reflected in the glass of the cafe window where I ate lunch, her shadow stretching long across the sidewalk even when the sun wasn't shining. I never saw her move. She was always still, always watching. I told myself it was nothing, an overactive imagination, a trick of the light. But there was a familiarity to her presence, an unshakable sense that she wasn't a stranger at all. I found myself scanning every street, every window, dreading and yet expecting to see her. I stopped sleeping, afraid of the dreams that had become a nightly occurrence. The corridor in my mind grew longer, darker, and always, she was there at the end of it. Then, one morning, I found a red thread tied around the doorknob of my apartment. It was thin, almost invisible, but impossibly tight, as though it had been wound over and over with meticulous care. I hesitated, staring at it, my hand frozen halfway to the knob. Finally, I untied it, the thread biting into my fingers as I worked it loose. It left faint red marks on my skin, and when I opened the door, I found another piece of thread on the floor, stretching inward toward my living room like a trail. I followed it. It led to my bedroom, coiled neatly on my pillow like a gift. My heart raced as I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. There was no note, no explanation, just the same impossibly tight knot in the center of the thread. I threw it away and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it wasn't strange, that someone had left it as a prank. But when I went to bed that night, the thread was back, tied around my wrist in a perfect bow. The woman appeared in my dreams again, this time closer. I could see her face now, pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and endless. She raised her hand, her fingers long and delicate, and pointed behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the endless corridor stretching into shadow. When I looked back at her, she was closer still. Her lips parted as though she was about to speak, but I woke before any sound came out. The thread started appearing everywhere, in my pockets, woven into my shoelaces, dangling from the ceiling like cobwebs. No matter how many times I threw it away, it returned, always perfectly tied, always waiting for me to find it. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. I could feel her eyes on me even when I was alone, her presence heavy in the room. I tried staying with friends, but the thread followed me there too, appearing on their doorknobs, their kitchen counters. They laughed it off, calling it strange but harmless, but I could see the unease in their eyes. One night, I woke to find my apartment bathed in a faint red glow. The thread was everywhere, crisscrossing the walls and furniture, weaving an intricate web that pulsed faintly, as though it were alive. At the center of the web stood the woman in red. She was no longer still. Her hand reached out to me, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't move. The air was thick, pressing against my chest, and the room seemed to tilt around her as though gravity itself bent in her presence. When her hand touched mine, the world went silent. The threads dissolved into nothing, the glow faded, and I was alone in my apartment, my hand outstretched toward empty air. I wanted to believe it had been a dream, but my palm was stained red, the mark of her touch vivid against my skin. I stopped going outside. I stopped answering calls, stopped eating. The threads wove tighter and tighter around my life, binding me to her in ways I couldn't understand. The corridor from my dreams seeped into my waking hours, the edges of my vision warping until I could no longer tell where it ended and reality began. One day, I found a note pinned to my door with a needle, the thread looping through the paper in delicate spirals. The handwriting was unfamiliar but elegant, the letters flowing together in perfect harmony. It read, "The knot must be untied." I don't know what it means, but the thread is everywhere now, covering the walls, the floors, even the air. I can feel it tightening around me, pulling me closer to something I can't see but know is waiting. I hear her voice in the silence, soft and distant, calling me down the corridor that has no end. I don't think I can resist much longer. It began with a name, not mine, someone else's. A name I'd never heard before, but which felt impossibly familiar, like a word perched on the edge of memory. I saw it first on the corner of a coffee receipt, scribbled messily by the barista. It didn't resemble the name I'd given them, not even close. For Nara, it read. Nara? I asked the barista as she slid the cup across the counter. She blinked at me, her hand already reaching for the next order slip. That's what you said, right? No, I said, Alex. Her brow furrowed, but only for a moment. Oh, weird. Sorry about that. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded distracted. I shrugged it off, took my coffee, and left, but the name lingered. It hummed faintly in the back of my thoughts, attaching itself to unrelated moments. The pattern in a puddle on the sidewalk. The looping string of an ad jingle on the radio. That night, when I opened my laptop to send an email, my hands hovered over the keyboard, unprompted, and typed, "Dear Nara." The email wasn't for her, whoever she was. I backspaced furiously, set the computer aside, and decided I was overtired. The name showed up again the next day, then the day after that, on a flyer taped to a lamppost, in the lyrics of a song playing in a store I'd never been to before. Once, as I walked home late from work, I swore I heard it spoken aloud, carried on the faint breeze. I stopped walking. The street was empty, the windows dark, but the sound lingered, clear as an echo. That night, I dreamed of her. I couldn't see her face. She was sitting on the edge of a lake, the water perfectly still and dark as glass. Her silhouette blurred against the strange glow of the sky, which flickered faintly, as though it were unsure of itself. She hummed softly, her voice barely audible, but when she turned toward me, I woke up. I had the name on my tongue, whispered before I realized I'd spoken it aloud. Nara. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a question. Over the following weeks, she grew more present. Not physically, not in any way I could explain to anyone else. But the world began to twist itself in small ways, pulling her into the margins of my life. Street signs changed. For a few seconds, an intersection I passed every day became Nara Crossing, though by the time I looked again, it was back to its usual name. My phone once buzzed with a notification, just her name in bold letters, and then cleared itself before I could tap it. The dream came back, too, each time more vivid. I started to notice details. The curve of her shoulders, the way the grass bent toward the water, the faint scent of cedar and something metallic. And each time I woke, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I'd look up from my desk at work and see someone staring, only for them to glance away the moment I noticed. At home, the reflection in my bathroom mirror seemed a fraction of a second slower than me, like it was waiting for the right moment to move on its own. Then, one night, she finally spoke. I was dreaming again. The lake, the stillness, the flickering sky. This time, I was closer to her, close enough to see her hands resting on her knees, close enough to hear the words. "You've forgotten," she said. Her voice wasn't angry or accusing. It was calm, even sad. "Forgotten what?" I asked, though the words felt hollow. "You knew once," she replied, tilting her head. The light shifted, and for the first time, I could see her face. It was mine, or almost mine. A near mirror, her features sharp where mine were soft, her eyes darker, deeper. "Who are you?" Her gaze fixed on mine. "You called me, and now you have to remember." I woke with the name etched behind my eyelids. The next day, I found her. It wasn't intentional. I'd been walking through the city, trying to clear my head, when I noticed a small, out-of-place shop tucked between two buildings. Its sign was old, the lettering faded, but I could still make out the name. Nara's Parlor. I didn't think. I stepped inside. The air inside was heavy, scented faintly with smoke and damp earth. Shelves lined the walls, filled with objects that didn't seem to belong together. A cracked tea set, a bundle of yellowed letters, a jar filled with smooth stones. Behind the counter stood a woman. She was exactly as I'd seen her in my dreams, though she looked older now, the shadows beneath her eyes deeper. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "You're late," she said, her tone flat. "Late for what?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't get an answer. She gestured to the counter, where a small, glass jar sat. Inside was a key, ornate, almost delicate, its surface tarnished with age. "This is yours," she said. "I've never seen it before." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You've always had it. You just forgot where you left it." My chest tightened. I didn't want to take it, but I couldn't stop myself. The moment my fingers closed around the jar, The world around me began to shift. The shop folded inward, the walls stretching and bending as though they were alive. The woman, Nara, watched me without moving, her expression unreadable. "Where does it go?" I managed to ask, clutching the jar to my chest. "Only you know," she said softly. "And when you open the door, you'll remember everything." The shop dissolved. I woke on the edge of the lake, the key in my hand. The sky above me flickered faintly, the horizon bending in on itself, and her voice whispered in my mind, "You called me. Now finish what you started." I never planned to stay in the motel overnight. It was the kind of place that barely deserved the term motel. A flat, crumbling strip of rooms, each with a flickering bulb and a warped door. But the rain came down in sheets so thick it felt like the world was dissolving outside my car windows. The vacancy sign glowed weakly, as if it too would give up at any moment, and I decided to take the risk. The man at the desk barely looked at me. His face was pale and shiny, his hands jittery as he slid me the key to room 12. He didn't bother with pleasantries or warnings about checkout times. I didn't mind. I just wanted to be out of the storm. Room 12 was worse than I'd expected. The wallpaper was peeling in long, damp strips, and the carpet squelched faintly underfoot. A single lamp threw a sickly yellow light over the bed, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. But I told myself it didn't matter. I wouldn't be here long. I showered quickly and climbed under the thin, scratchy blanket, trying not to think about the stains on the ceiling or the faint creaks coming from somewhere in the building. The storm outside raged on, and I let its noise drown out everything else. It was the sound of footsteps that woke me. They were soft at first, hesitant, as though someone were walking barefoot down the hallway. I blinked in the darkness. The rain outside reduced to a faint drizzle. The clock on the nightstand didn't work. It was stuck at 3:12, its hands twitching faintly. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice dry and cracked. There was no response, but the air shifted, heavy and expectant. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times I tapped it. The room felt darker than it should have, as though the single lamp were holding back a tide of shadows that wanted to spill in. I told myself to go back to sleep. It was probably the man from the desk or another guest, someone just as stranded as me. But when I rolled over, I saw it. The mirror on the far wall. I hadn't noticed it before. It was tucked between the bathroom door and the closet, an old oval thing with a tarnished frame. But it wasn't the mirror itself that caught my attention. It was the fact that my reflection was still sitting up, even though I wasn't. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. I sat up again, rubbing my eyes, but the figure in the mirror stayed frozen. Its head was tilted slightly to the side. Its mouth parted just enough to suggest a breath or a word about to be spoken. It didn't move. Neither did I. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't me at all. The face was mine, but the details were wrong. Too sharp in some places, too blurred in others, as though the mirror were trying and failing to recreate me. The figure tilted its head further, and the room felt colder. I didn't know what to do. My body felt leaden, pinned by the weight of something I couldn't name. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs wouldn't move. The figure smiled. The knock on the door broke the spell. It was loud and frantic, 3 sharp raps that shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart hammering as I looked away from the mirror. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer. I approached the door cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to stay back. Through the peephole, the hallway looked empty. I turned the lock slowly, bracing myself, and opened the door just a crack. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb near the desk. The air smelled damp and old, like the motel itself had been abandoned for years. I almost closed the door when I noticed the paper. It was folded neatly and placed just outside, its edges curling slightly from the moisture. I picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it. "Don't look at it again." The handwriting was jagged and slanted, as though the writer had been in a hurry or unsteady. I shut the door and turned back to the room. The mirror was empty. The figure was gone, the surface reflecting only the dull, lifeless room behind me. But I didn't feel alone. The rest of the night passed in fragments. I sat on the bed, clutching the note, listening to the storm outside and the faint creaks of the building. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. Everything seemed normal. The carpet was still damp, the clock still broken, but the air felt lighter. The mirror reflected only what it should, and the room was silent except for the faint hum of the lamp. I left without stopping by the desk. The man behind the counter didn't look up as I dropped the key in the return box. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but there was something in the reflection just behind the car. A figure standing in the middle of the road, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. I didn't stop. I don't know if it followed me, but every now and then, I catch glimpses of something in reflective surfaces. A shadow that doesn't belong, a face that isn't mine. I've stopped using mirrors altogether. For years, my brother Alex had been obsessed with an online puzzle called the Infinite Labyrinth. It wasn't a game you downloaded or a site you could visit. It was a scattered, cryptic web of riddles, hidden forums, coded messages, and obscure websites that seemed to exist solely for the purpose of leading deeper into itself. People claimed it had no origin, no creator. Some said it was just an elaborate social experiment. Others insisted it was a gateway to something far darker. Alex didn't care about theories. For him, it was the challenge that mattered, solving the unsolvable. He spent hours, sometimes days, piecing through fragments of code, analyzing strange symbols, decoding nonsensical strings of numbers. I used to think it was harmless, a rabbit hole for bored people on the internet. That changed the night Alex disappeared. I came home from work to find his computer on, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. His chair was pushed back like he'd left in a hurry, but his shoes were still by the door, and his keys were on the counter. "Alex," I called, but the apartment was silent. The screen showed a simple black page with white text. "Do you want to see the end?" Below it, there were two buttons, yes and a no. I clicked a no out of instinct, but nothing happened. The buttons flickered, the text distorted, and the question reappeared. "Do you want to see the end?" This time, yes was already highlighted. I clicked it. The screen flashed, then went black. For a moment, I thought the computer had crashed, but then the monitor filled with a low-resolution image of a door. It looked old, warped, the kind you'd see in an abandoned building. A command prompt appeared at the bottom. "Open the door?" I hesitated. The image changed. The door creaked open slightly, just enough to show the blackness behind it. "It's already open." I pushed the chair back, my chest tight. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, damp and sour, like wet wood left to rot. I thought it was coming from the kitchen or maybe the pipes, but as I moved closer to Alex's computer, it grew stronger. The screen changed again. This time, it showed a live feed. It was a dimly lit hallway, narrow and lined with rough stone walls. The camera tilted slightly as though being carried, the view bobbing with each step. "Alex," I whispered, my voice trembling. The camera stopped abruptly, focusing on a corner ahead. A shadow moved, quick, unnatural, and the screen went black. The next moment, my phone buzzed on the table. A single text message appeared. "Help me." The number wasn't Alex's. I didn't know what to do. I called the police, but they were dismissive. No signs of foul play, no evidence Alex had been abducted. "People walk away sometimes," they said. But Alex hadn't walked away. Over the next few days, the texts kept coming. They were short, fragmented, but always desperate. "It's cold. Can't see. They're watching." I tried to reply, but every message bounced back as undeliverable. I couldn't stop thinking about the live feed, the hallway, the shadow. I started researching the Infinite Labyrinth, combing through forums, piecing together what little information I could find. Most people dismissed it as a myth, but a few claimed to have reached the deeper levels. They spoke in cryptic phrases, warning of thresholds that can't be uncrossed, and the maze that takes more than it gives. One user stood out, a poster named Chimera, who claimed to have been trapped inside the labyrinth for months before finding a way back. Their posts were frantic, often deleted within hours, but one thread caught my attention. The labyrinth isn't a game, they wrote. It's a doorway. You don't solve it, you enter it. And once you're inside, it knows you. I messaged Chimera, desperate for answers. To my surprise, they replied almost immediately. Don't follow him. I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Who are you talking about? I typed. The reply was instant. Your brother. It's not him anymore. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing. That night, the smell returned. It was stronger, filling the apartment with a damp, choking heaviness. And then, the knocking started. It came from the living room wall, slow and deliberate, like someone tapping just behind the plaster. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding, and followed the sound. The knocking moved, leading me to Alex's computer. The screen was on again, showing the same stone hallway. This time, there was no shadow. Instead, Alex stood in the frame, his back to the camera. Alex! I shouted, leaning closer. He turned. His face was wrong. It was Alex, but not him. His eyes were too dark, his mouth stretched into a thin, unnatural smile. He raised a hand and pointed toward the camera, or toward me. The knocking grew louder. I turned toward the wall, and for the first time, I noticed something impossible, a door. It hadn't been there before. It was old, warped, identical to the one I'd seen on the screen. The knocking came again, louder, more insistent. Against every instinct, I reached for the handle. The air grew cold, my breath fogging as I twisted the knob. On the other side was the hallway. The stone walls stretched endlessly, disappearing into shadows. The smell was overwhelming now, sour and damp, almost alive. Alex, I whispered, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The last thing I remember was the sound of laughter, faint and echoing, as though coming from far, far below. Now, I'm the one sending the messages. I don't know if anyone can hear me, but if you're reading this, don't open the door. The suitcase sat in the corner of the bedroom, zipped shut but bulging at the seams, like a secret straining to be told. It didn't belong to me. That much was clear from the shiny black leather and the airline tag with a destination I'd never been to, Reykjavik. We hadn't planned a trip, at least not together. And he certainly hadn't mentioned Iceland. I stared at it for a moment, willing it to explain itself, but the room stayed quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. When he got home that evening, I waited until he put down his keys and kicked off his shoes. What's with the suitcase? I asked, my voice steady. He blinked, his face a picture of confusion. Suitcase? In the bedroom, I said. He hesitated, just long enough to make the room feel heavier, then laughed. Oh, that. It's not mine. Probably left by the movers or something. We hadn't had movers in 3 years. Strange, I said, watching him closely. It has your name on the tag. He froze, just for a fraction of a second, before shrugging. Must have been from an old trip. I'll get rid of it. That night, while he slept, I unzipped the suitcase. Inside was a careful arrangement of clothes, all neatly folded, along with a small toiletry bag and a book I'd never seen before. A worn paperback with a dog-eared page near the middle. The title was unremarkable, but the inscription on the inside cover stopped me cold. To us, and all the places we'll go. Jay. I didn't know anyone named Jay. The next morning, I asked him about it over coffee. Have you been to Iceland? He looked up from his phone, his expression guarded. Why do you ask? Just curious, I said. It's a pretty specific destination for someone who hates the cold. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. Iceland? No. Why would I go there? For the next week, I couldn't shake the feeling that the suitcase was watching me, its presence looming even after he moved it to the garage. I tried to distract myself, filling my days with errands and projects, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until I found the envelope that everything began to unravel. It was tucked between the pages of the book from the suitcase, a simple white envelope sealed with a piece of gold tape. I debated whether to open it, but my curiosity burned too brightly. Inside was a photograph. It showed him standing on a rocky cliff, the ocean crashing behind him, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a woman I didn't recognize. She was laughing, her hair wild in the wind, and he was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen in years. On the back of the photo was a date, just 3 weeks ago. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I started paying closer attention. His late-night phone calls, muffled laughter from the other room, and the way his phone was always face down on the table. It was all there, plain as day, once I allowed myself to see it. One Saturday, when he said he had a work meeting, I followed him. He drove to a small cafe on the edge of town, parking in a spot that seemed too carefully chosen. I waited in my car, heart pounding, as he went inside. 10 minutes later, the woman from the photograph joined him. They didn't hold hands or kiss, but the way they leaned toward each other, the way their conversation seemed to bubble with an energy I couldn't touch, it was enough. That evening, when he got home, I placed the photo on the kitchen table. He saw it immediately, his face shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In your suitcase," I said. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sank into the chair across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then what is it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a fish struggling for air. "It's complicated," he said finally. I laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "Of course it is." For the next hour, he told me a story I hadn't asked to hear. About Jay, her name was Julia, and how they'd met at a conference last year. How their connection had been instant, electric. How it had turned into something he hadn't intended but couldn't stop. When he was finished, he looked at me, his eyes pleading. "It doesn't mean I don't love you." I stared at him, feeling both numb and raw. "You don't get to say that," I said quietly. That night, he slept on the couch. By morning, he was gone, leaving behind an empty closet and a single message on the whiteboard in the kitchen. "I'm sorry." I didn't respond. Weeks later, I packed up the suitcase, the book, and the photograph and left them on his mother's porch. I didn't want them in my house anymore. The following spring, I booked a ticket to Iceland. I stood on the cliffs where the photograph had been taken, the wind whipping around me, and I felt nothing but relief. Some secrets weigh you down, but letting them go can set you free. There's a house at the end of my street that doesn't belong. It's not abandoned, though it looks like it should be. The shingles are warped, the paint is peeling, and the front porch lists to one side like it's bowing under the weight of too many secrets. The lawn, if you can call it that, is a tangled mess of weeds that never seem to grow or die. But the windows are always spotless, gleaming like fresh ice no matter how gray the sky gets. I never noticed the house as a kid, even though I walked by it every day on my way to school. It was just another piece of scenery, blending into the background like a shadow. But now, as an adult who'd moved back into my childhood neighborhood out of necessity rather than nostalgia, I couldn't stop looking at it. It wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to recognition. I first noticed it on a rainy afternoon when my car wouldn't start, forcing me to walk home from work. As I passed the house, I thought I saw movement behind the curtains, just a flicker, quick enough to make me question whether I'd really seen it. When I turned back, the curtain fell still. The next day, I found a letter in my mailbox. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper that felt too heavy for its size. The handwriting was neat but old-fashioned, the letters curling elegantly like something out of another century. "Come by for tea." It wasn't signed. I laughed it off at first. A joke. Maybe one of the neighbors being cheeky? But as I stood on my porch, rereading the note, I felt that same pull toward the house at the end of the street. That night, I dreamed of it. In the dream, I stood at the foot of the driveway, staring up at the windows. The curtains rippled, though there was no breeze. The porch light was on, casting a weak, amber glow that didn't seem to reach the edges of the yard. And then the front door creaked open, just wide enough for someone, or something, to peek through. I woke with the taste of ash in my mouth. By the end of the week, the dreams were nightly. They grew more vivid, more insistent. In one, I stood in the hallway just beyond the front door, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air smelled of lavender and decay, a scent that seemed to cling to my skin even after I woke. I started avoiding the house, taking longer routes just to keep it out of sight. But that only made it worse. No matter how far I went, I'd feel its pull, a magnetic weight dragging me back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned the color of rust, I gave in. The front gate swung open with a groan, the sound too loud in the stillness. The weeds seemed to part for me as I walked up the path, their jagged edges brushing against my legs like claws. The porch creaked underfoot, the boards bowing slightly with each step. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles touched the wood, the door opened. The smell hit me first, lavender, stronger now, almost choking. It rolled out in waves, mingling with the faintest hint of something metallic. "Come in," a voice called from inside. It wasn't a question. I stepped over the threshold, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft click. The house was dim, the only light coming from a single chandelier that hung low over a table set for two. The walls were lined with photographs, all in black and white. I didn't recognize any of the faces, but their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. At the table sat a woman. Her hair was silver, coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, and she wore a dress that might have been fashionable decades ago. She looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're late," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. I sat, though my body screamed at me to run. "Tea?" she asked, pouring from a pot I hadn't seen her pick up. The liquid was dark, almost black, and the steam that rose from it smelled faintly of earth. I didn't drink. The woman watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her eyes, I realized, were the same as the ones in the photographs on the walls. "Why did you call me here?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Her smile widened. "You came because you were always going to. It's in your nature." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I should go," I said. She tilted her head, studying me like I was some curious insect. "You can't leave until it's finished." "Until what's finished?" The chandelier flickered, and the room seemed to stretch, the walls pulling farther away. The air grew colder, the lavender scent replaced by something sharp and sour. "You," she said simply. The teacup in front of me shattered, the liquid inside pooling on the table. But it wasn't tea anymore. It moved, dark and viscous, crawling toward me like a living thing. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, and ran for the door. The hallway stretched endlessly, each step dragging me farther from the exit. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift, the faces growing clearer, sharper. I realized with a jolt of terror that one of them was mine. When I finally burst through the front door, the world outside wasn't my street. It was the house and only the house, its edges folding into themselves like paper. I don't know how long I've been here. The photographs in the hallway change sometimes. New faces appear, while others vanish. The woman is always there, watching, waiting. And now there's a second chair at the table, set just for me. I never noticed the billboard before, though I must have passed it hundreds of times. It sat at the edge of the highway just outside of town, half hidden by a cluster of oak trees, its peeling paint blending with the rust-colored foliage. But that night, as I drove home in the dark, the headlights of my car caught something unusual. The billboard was no longer blank. In bold, black letters, a message stretched across its faded white surface. "Emma, come see." I slammed on the brakes. The name, it was mine. The highway was empty, no cars in sight, and the glow of my taillights painted the asphalt red as I stared in disbelief. I rolled the window down, the cool autumn air rushing in, but the silence outside was absolute. No hum of passing engines, no chirp of crickets, just me and that message hanging in the night like a dare. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Emma wasn't an uncommon name, and the sign could have been directed at anyone. Still, my pulse quickened as I pressed the accelerator, leaving the billboard behind. Its ominous invitation burned into my mind. By the time I got home, I'd convinced myself it was a prank, some teenager with a ladder and too much time on their hands. But I checked the locks on my doors twice that night, and my dreams were restless, tangled with fragments of words and empty highways. The next day, The message followed me. It was on the window of a bakery downtown, scrawled in soap across the glass. "Come see." The shop owner wiped it clean with a look of irritation before I could ask about it. Later, at the gas station, I saw it again, this time on a weathered flyer taped to the pump. "Come see." I tore the flyer down, crumpling it in my fist, my stomach twisting with unease. Someone was targeting me. It was the only explanation. That night, I stayed inside, refusing to turn on the TV or check my phone. Every noise from the street outside made my heart jump, a car door slamming, the faint shuffle of footsteps on the sidewalk. When the knock came at my door, it was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I didn't answer. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, each sound dragging me closer to panic. My phone was in my hand before I realized it, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice crackled through the line. "What's your emergency?" "There's someone at my door," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "They've been knocking for several minutes. I don't know who it is." A pause. "Is your name Emma?" My breath caught in my throat. "How do you know that?" The line went dead. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep that night, the silence pressing against me like a weight. At sunrise, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The street was empty, but when I opened the door, I found a piece of paper taped to it. In the same bold, black letters, it read, "Tonight, come see." I tore the paper down, my hands trembling. This wasn't a prank anymore. It felt deliberate, personal. Someone wanted me to follow their instructions. Someone knew where I lived. I should have called the police again, but the memory of the operator's voice stopped me. How had they known my name? As the day dragged on, I couldn't shake the sense of inevitability. The phrase was everywhere, etched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror, spelled out in the arrangement of junk mail on my kitchen table. I felt cornered, like a rabbit trapped by a fox's gaze. When night fell, I got into my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going, but my hands moved on their own, guiding me back to the highway, back to the billboard. It was waiting for me. The letters were larger now, sharper, as though they'd been carved into the surface with something heavy. "Come see." Below the message was an arrow, pointing down a narrow dirt road that cut through the woods. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly, but some part of me, the part that needed answers, that needed this to stop, took over. I turned onto the dirt road. The path was rough, the trees closing in on either side, their branches clawing at my car as if trying to hold me back. The headlights illuminated only a few feet ahead, the rest swallowed by darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as the car crept forward. After what felt like hours, I saw a clearing up ahead. In the center stood a single structure, a small, decrepit house. Its roof sagged under the weight of neglect, and the windows were dark, their glass reflecting nothing. The front door was ajar, the faint sound of creaking hinges breaking the stillness. I should have left. I should have turned the car around and driven until the sun rose. But I didn't. Something about the house felt magnetic, pulling me closer. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling as I approached the open door. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust and earth. Inside, the darkness was total. My phone's flashlight did little to cut through it, the beam bouncing off warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was a mirror, its surface cracked and warped, the frame thick with blackened wood. Written across the glass, in dripping red letters, were the words, "Look closer." I didn't want to, but my body moved on its own. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and wrong. My face looked too thin, my eyes too wide, and then my reflection blinked. I didn't. The thing in the mirror smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, teeth too sharp to belong to anything human. "Thank you for coming," it said, its voice low and crawling with malice. I stumbled back, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed there, smiling, and then it stepped out of the mirror. The last thing I remember is its cold, bony fingers gripping my wrist, pulling me forward. The glass shattered around me, and the world turned inside out. Now, I'm here, in the house, and the mirror? It's waiting for someone else. Come see. I inherited the house on Blackwood Lane after my uncle passed away. We weren't particularly close, but I was the only family he had left. When the lawyer handed me the keys, he described the house as rustic, which I quickly learned was a generous euphemism for in desperate need of repair. The first time I saw it, I felt something shift in me. Not the warm nostalgia of old family homes, but something colder, something quieter, like the house had been holding its breath for a very long time. It sat alone at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by a thicket of trees that pressed too close, their gnarled branches clawing at the windows. I should have sold it, but there was something about the house that made it hard to leave. It wasn't the creaking floorboards or the way the air smelled faintly of cedar and decay. It was the feeling that it wanted me to stay. I moved in on a crisp October afternoon. The light struggled through the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the living room walls. The house was furnished with relics from my uncle's life: threadbare chairs, a mahogany dining table, stacks of books with crumbling spines. In the corner of the sitting room was an antique mirror, its silver frame tarnished and its glass fogged with age. I avoided it at first. It wasn't that it scared me, at least, not exactly, but it had a presence, like it was waiting for me to look too closely. That night, as I was unpacking in the kitchen, I heard the first sound, a faint shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the floor upstairs. I froze, listening, but the house fell silent. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses groaned and shifted, their bones settling into place. Still, I locked my bedroom door before going to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange. A single chair in the dining room had been moved. It now sat facing the mirror in the sitting room, its legs slightly misaligned with the worn rug beneath it. I was certain I hadn't touched it, but I didn't dwell on it. I dragged it back to its place and went about my day. By the third night, I was no longer sleeping well. The noises had become more frequent, soft, deliberate creaks that never seemed to come from the same place twice. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps in the hallway. Other times, like the distant murmur of a voice, too low to make out. The mirror began to bother me more. Its position seemed slightly different each time I passed it, its surface catching the dim light in a way that made it hard to ignore. I'd swear I saw movement in it once, but when I turned to look, the room behind me was empty. One evening, as I was organizing the books in the sitting room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Something was wrong. At first glance, it was just me, sitting cross-legged on the floor, my head bent over an old novel. But my reflection didn't move when I did. It sat there, still and staring, until I turned away. I didn't go back into that room for 2 days. When I finally did, it was because I couldn't avoid it any longer. I'd convinced myself that my imagination had gotten the better of me, that the stress of inheriting the house had stirred up old fears. I decided to face the mirror head-on. It was a mistake. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection. At first, everything seemed normal. Me, the room behind me, the faint flicker of candlelight. But as I looked closer, I noticed a figure in the far corner of the mirror. It wasn't in the room behind me. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It stood perfectly still, its outline just sharp enough to make out. I turned, expecting to see someone in the room, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The figure remained in the mirror, its body looming in a way that defied the boundaries of the glass. It moved, slow and deliberate, one step closer for every heartbeat. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed a sheet from the couch and threw it over the mirror, my hands shaking. That night, I dreamed of the house as it had been decades ago, vibrant and alive with laughter. But in the dream, the mirror stood uncovered, and the same figure watched from its depths, its hand pressed against the glass. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The mirror was uncovered when I went downstairs the next morning. The sheet lay crumpled on the floor, and the glass was pristine, clearer than it had been since I arrived. The figure was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. The air in the house felt heavier, thicker, like I was no longer alone. I tried to leave that afternoon, but the gravel road that led to the house was blocked by a fallen tree, its massive trunk stretching across the path. It hadn't been there the day before. I called a tree service, but the line crackled and died before I could speak to anyone. By the 5th day, the house was no longer pretending to be subtle. Doors slammed in the middle of the night. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. And the mirror began to whisper. I never understood the words. It was a low, guttural murmur that filled the room whenever I passed. I smashed it with a hammer on the 6th night, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. But even broken, it wouldn't leave me. I found shards of it everywhere. In my shoes, under my pillow, glinting in the moonlight outside my window. And in every piece, the figure stared back at me, waiting. I left the house the next morning, abandoning everything I couldn't carry. I never went back. But even now, in my new apartment, I can't escape it. Every reflective surface carries its shadow. Every night, I dream of the house, of the mirror, of the figure stepping closer and closer. I don't know what it is or why it chose me, but I know it won't stop. One day, it'll reach me, and I'll have nowhere left to run. It was always there, the room without a door. Our house wasn't old, nor was it particularly unique. A 2-story suburban relic of the 1980s, it had the kind of floor plan you could find replicated in 100 neighborhoods across the country. Growing up, it always felt normal, bland in a way I didn't think much about until years later, when I started noticing how other people's houses didn't hum like ours did. The hum wasn't loud. It was almost imperceptible, like the faint buzz of electricity when you're too close to power lines. Most visitors didn't even notice it, or if they did, they dismissed it as the quirks of an aging house. But for us, it was constant, and it always came from the same place, the wall behind the upstairs hallway. When I was a child, I asked my mother about it. Why the hallway had that strange, blank stretch of wall that didn't match the rest of the house. Why the hum got louder when I pressed my ear against it. She'd stiffen whenever I brought it up, her eyes darting toward the stairs as if she expected someone, or something, to be listening. "It's nothing," she'd say, too quickly. "Just old wiring." I didn't believe her then, and I don't believe her now. The first time I tried to find it, I was 8. Armed with a flashlight and a wooden spoon I'd stolen from the kitchen, I decided to solve the mystery of the humming wall. I knocked on the plaster, half expecting it to crumble away and reveal some secret passage. But the wall held firm, smooth and solid beneath my fingers. The hum deepened, almost as if it was aware of me. I didn't try again for years. By the time I was 17, the house had started to feel smaller. My siblings had moved out, and my parents were often away for work. Left alone for long stretches, I couldn't help but notice how the hum seemed louder at night, how the air in the upstairs hallway felt heavier, denser, like walking through fog. I'd stand there sometimes, staring at the wall, trying to understand why it made me so uneasy. There was nothing unusual about it on the surface, just a flat expanse of paint, slightly discolored with age. Yet it drew me in, an itch I couldn't scratch. One night, unable to sleep, I gave in. The tools were makeshift, a hammer and chisel from the garage, a flashlight, a thin pair of gloves. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just indulging a childhood curiosity. But when the first chunk of plaster fell away, revealing not the wooden frame I'd expected but a smooth, black surface beneath, my stomach dropped. It wasn't drywall. It wasn't anything I recognized. The material was cold, almost metallic, yet it didn't reflect the flashlight's beam. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over it, the surface strangely soft, like skin stretched too tightly over bone. The hum was louder now, vibrating through my chest. I should have stopped. Instead, I kept going, chipping away more of the wall until I exposed a rectangular outline. 7 feet tall, perfectly proportioned. It wasn't a wall. It was a door. But there was no handle, no hinges, nothing to suggest it could be opened. Just that black, unnatural surface, humming steadily. I pressed my palm against it. The door pulsed, a faint ripple spreading outward from where I touched it. Then, with a low, resonant sound that seemed to shake the entire house, it slid open. What lay beyond wasn't a room. It was a corridor, impossibly long, stretching into darkness. The air was colder here, tinged with a metallic smell that made my throat tighten. The walls were made of the same black material, their surfaces rippling faintly as though alive. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the hum was louder now, filling my ears, my mind, pulling me forward. I stepped inside. The corridor didn't feel like part of the house. The ceiling was too high, the angles too sharp, the floor too smooth. My footsteps didn't echo, as though the space absorbed sound. The farther I walked, the more I felt it. Something watching me, just out of sight. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the first door. Unlike the one I'd opened, this door was small, almost human-sized, and set into the wall at an odd angle. It didn't have a handle, just a faint, circular pattern etched into its surface. I pressed my hand to the circle, and the door opened soundlessly. Inside was a room that shouldn't have existed. It was my bedroom, or something like it. The layout was the same, the furniture in the same places. But everything was wrong. The colors were muted, the edges too sharp, the bed slightly too large for the frame. And sitting on the bed was someone who looked exactly like me. Not a mirror image, not a twin. Me. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with an expression that was almost, but not quite, human. The hum shifted, rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. The figure tilted their head, their lips curling into a smile that didn't reach their eyes. "You shouldn't have opened the door," they said, their voice a perfect echo of mine. I ran. The corridor seemed longer now, stretching endlessly, the walls narrowing until I could feel their cold surface brushing against my shoulders. The hum followed me, growing louder, sharper, until it was all I could hear. When I finally stumbled back into the hallway of my house, the door slammed shut behind me, the black surface sealing itself seamlessly. The hum stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the wall was whole again, as though nothing had ever been there. I tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination, something my mind had conjured in the grip of insomnia. But every now and then, late at night, I hear it again. The faint hum, deep and steady, coming from behind the wall. The door is still there, waiting, and I know one day it will open on its own. I had always been good with routines. They kept life manageable, predictable. Every morning, I'd wake at 6:45, drink my coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, then walk to work, always taking the same path. It was a quiet route, lined with brick houses and overgrown gardens, ending with a shortcut through an alley behind the library. I liked the consistency of it. I liked knowing exactly what came next. But one Thursday, something was different. The alley was longer. I didn't notice at first. I was halfway down the narrow stretch, my shoes crunching against loose gravel, when I realized I'd been walking longer than usual. The buildings on either side seemed taller, their windows dark, their brick faces worn down to a hollow gray. I stopped, glancing back toward the street I'd come from. It was still there, just as I'd left it, the early sunlight pooling over the sidewalk. Nothing felt wrong, exactly, but there was a strange tightness in my chest, a faint tug of hesitation. The air smelled odd, faintly metallic, like the sharp tang of blood or rust. I kept walking, shaking off the unease, and eventually the alley spilled out into the familiar square behind the library. By the time I reached my office, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of my own perception, maybe. I'm not one to dwell on minor things. I let it go. The next day, I noticed the graffiti. It wasn't new, at least it didn't look new, but it hadn't been there before. At the midpoint of the alley, someone had scrawled a long string of numbers in red paint. I couldn't make sense of them. 18, 44, 27, 12, and so on. A jumbled sequence running in uneven rows down the side of the wall. The numbers weren't large, but they stood out against the faded brick, and I found myself staring at them longer than I intended. It wasn't just the content that unsettled me. It was the way the paint looked. Wet, dripping, though it hadn't rained in days. I shook my head and walked on, but the numbers lingered in my mind throughout the day. By the time I was heading home, curiosity had gotten the better of me. I took the same path, the same alley, intending to snap a photo of the graffiti, but when I arrived, it was gone. The bricks were clean, untouched, as if the numbers had never existed. That night, I dreamt of the alley. I was walking down it again, though it was darker this time. The walls towering above me like the sides of a canyon. The numbers were there, glowing faintly, twisting and shifting as I tried to read them. Somewhere ahead, I could hear footsteps, soft, deliberate, just out of sight. They didn't sound like they belonged to anyone in a hurry. They sounded like someone waiting. I woke drenched in sweat, the echo of those footsteps still thudding in my ears. By Monday, the alley had changed again. It was subtle at first. The angle of the walls, the texture of the ground. There were puddles now, though the sky had been clear for weeks. The air smelled heavier, damp and sour, and the light didn't seem to reach the center of the passage. When I reached the far end, it felt like I'd walked twice as far as usual. My steps dragged, as though the ground were pulling at my feet. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing but the empty stretch of bricks, receding into shadow. The following morning, I resolved to take a different route. I told myself it was practical, construction, maybe, or some kind of city maintenance, but deep down, I was avoiding it. Yet as I neared the turn I usually took, my legs moved without thought, steering me toward the alley. I don't know why. It felt almost reflexive, like muscle memory, as if my body already knew where it needed to go. By the time I realized what I was doing, I was already inside. This time, the graffiti was back, but the numbers were different. They glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, and now they were accompanied by something else. A single word, scrawled beneath them in blocky red letters. Stay. The air thickened around me, the metallic tang sharp enough to sting. I turned, intending to leave, but the alley seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions. The street was gone. The library square was gone. It was just me and the endless corridor of bricks, the graffiti flickering like a dying bulb. My breath quickened, and for a moment, I was sure I could hear the footsteps again, distant but growing closer. The sound made my skin crawl. I broke into a run, my heart pounding, and the alley finally spat me out onto a street I didn't recognize. The buildings were wrong, too old, too narrow, their windows darkened by grime. The streetlights flickered above, casting everything in a sickly yellow haze. The people walking past didn't look at me, their faces blurred and indistinct, like smudges on a fogged mirror. I turned back toward the alley, but it was gone, replaced by a solid brick wall. Panic coiled in my chest. I walked down the street, searching for a landmark, a sign, anything familiar, but the further I went, the less sense the place made. The sky above was colorless, blank, and the air felt stagnant, heavy with a silence that pressed against my ears. I don't know how long I wandered, but eventually, I saw it. The entrance to the alley, waiting for me at the end of the street. It was identical to the one I'd entered that morning, down to the faint graffiti scrawled on the walls. Stay. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me toward it, and the moment I stepped inside, I was back in my neighborhood, standing in the square behind the library. The sky was normal again. The people had faces. I stumbled home, shaking, and locked the door behind me. I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. I called in sick, ignoring the outside world as best I could, but the alley haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the numbers, the smell, the way it had swallowed me whole and spit me out somewhere else. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, I found the graffiti had changed again. This time, the numbers spelled out a date. It was tomorrow. I haven't gone to work since. The alley is still there, waiting. I know better than to enter it now, but at night, I can hear it calling to me, the faint rustle of wind and footsteps just outside my window. The numbers are etched into my mind, their rhythm thrumming against my skull. I don't know what will happen when the date comes, but something tells me I won't have a choice. The alley doesn't care about my choices. It only cares that I follow.